Уважаемые дамы и господа, я думаю, что нам нужно начинать наш круглый стол, несмотря на перемещение и некоторые...
Dear ladies and gentlemen, we're gonna start our session. Due to some organizational problems, we have a certain delay, but we're expecting quite an interesting discussion today, and I hope we will also use this round table very successful for all of us. First, I would like to introduce the delegates and speakers. I would like to start with Alexei, Alexei Ivanov from the Skolkovo Foundation. He is my co-moderator. He is responsible for the legal reform. Dear colleagues, we decided to split the introduction into several parts. I will start with the people on my right, and Anna will introduce the delegate sitting on her left. I would like to start with Mikhail Yakushev, who was attending the Internet Freedom and Security Roundtable, and they were discussing what is better, freedom or security in Internet. And Mikhail is one of the pioneers of law in IT and Internet. He has been involved with these issues at Microsoft, and was also working for the Ministry of Telecommunication of Russia, and he also is representing the Coordination Center for Internet in Russia, and now he is heading one of the biggest association of Internet companies, which is called RAIC. The next speaker is Ilya Levin. Ilya was one of the organizers of the Russian school education. He was one of the researchers headed by Mr. Velihov from the Soviet Academy of Science. He was heading the project, the school project, and they were aiming at automation and IT implementation in the school education. It was quite a complicated project. Then Ilya continued this activity. Now he's working at the University of Tel Aviv at the School of Education. He is heading a chair which is also called IT Technologies for Education. And Ilya probably was one of the first users of Internet in the Soviet Union. It was in 1986 through the very secret protocol of the Soviet Committee of State Security. Then next speaker is Ruslan Ibrahimov. He is the vice president of the biggest mobile cell operator, and he normally insists that the cell operators are a very friendly family in Russia and not the competitors. And he will also highlight the topic of network neutralism in our discussion, so we weren't avoided. Then Mikhail Zolotaryov, he is heading the Center of IT Expertise at the Russian Academy of Economics under the Russian president, and he's responsible for the IT technologies in Russia for a long time, and he was one of the developers of the Electronic Russia program. He wrote a reform program for Mikhail Prokhorov. Oh, was it just a joke? Oh, no, it's partly a joke. I think it's quite important. And I also want you to love him. I would like to go on. I would like to introduce the European American speakers of our round table. And there's Ianis Leonas. He is a specialist of EU law for the anti-monopoly law and social media law, and he will also tell us today what position the European Union has, what trends are currently in Great Britain. The next delegate of our round table is Martin Adam. He is a specialist in social media. He's a lawyer. He's involved in M&A business and can also assess the role of social media in the company activities, especially in M&A business, what is quite an interesting aspect of our activity, especially on the topic of our roundtable. Timothy Wu is a professor of law faculty at the University of Columbia. He wrote a lot of books about the network neutralism. He also knows how the anti-monopoly regulation works in the United States, and he will also tell something about it today. And my colleague Dmitry Petrov, he works together with me at Megaphone company, the second largest cell operator in Russia, and we also support the friendship ideology and cooperation in all the areas. And I also would like to introduce another person who is not in the panel now. This is Mr. Nikolai Kardashov. He's the head of the department and the anti-monopoly agents service of the Russian Federation, and he really knows what the manipulation in the commercial and advertising market is, how the advertisements can be used for so-called bad purposes. And we really want Nikolai to help us and tell us more about the practice and take part in our debates. I'd like to come over to the discussion itself. We want our discussion to be as interactive as possible. That's why we were going to make short presentations, and the first topic is more philosophical and set limits for the legal regulation, because we are here at a legal forum. These topics are connected with the privacy and how the modern technologies of using personal user data can be used for the targeted advertisement, and how can we create a new product of civil law like personal data, or personal information. The second topic is devoted to the new marketing, and this is quite a new thing for us, but in America and in Europe this marketing has been existing for a dozen of years. So we'd like to track the development of the legislation, how the legislation corresponds to the technologies is used for collecting and processing personal data. And the third topic, which is probably the most developed one in the law of Russia and other countries, and it's also a question accommodates some financial business aspects, as the topic of network neutralism. And I mean here the services in internet, and we as a cell operator have our own opinion about it, and we will also discuss this issue in quite a broad way. So it was my short introduction, and I would like to tell you just one more thing for the beginning of our discussion, because the protection of the privacy, the protection of personal data, this is some items in the law that has been existing for 200 years, and we also recognize the privacy and personal data of people. However, we also understand that the technologies are developing, and the existence of social media and other services require also to use this personal data for us as for use. So the limits of these definitions are getting more precise, but in reality, we do not really see these limits because in Russia, we think that the personal data are the data that can allow us to identify certain user, for example, the identification, the address, and so on. For the social media and for other users, some other aspects may be of a greater interest. What we like, who are our friends, and so on. And here, probably we need to set a certain separation in order to make clear definitions for them to work. We're also going to discuss here that the European Union and the United States created new directives this year, and these directives deal with the privacy protection. I don't want to tell you more detail about it right now because we're going to speak about it later. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Levin because he is an expert in the IT development. He is actually one who was actually at the very beginning of the social media history. So I'm interested in your opinion. Okay, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this forum, of this brilliant forum, for the opportunity to express my opinion. And I'm really happy because I was born here and it is quite good to come here and share my thoughts with you. And a great honor to express some general ideas. I will talk only about general ideas, and I would like to tell you an old Soviet joke when a propagandist came to agriculture enterprises and they were to issue the preparation for the winter and the construction of communism. Because we do not have any timber to burn, we will start the construction of communism. So I would like to start with the second issue and then we go back to the timber. It was very pragmatic, but I'd like to express some conceptual ideas as the result of our research and we also made quite a long way in IT, so we can say something here. The first thing, the changes in the society are accepted as very global. It is not only the use of some new information, so resources, not only the use of telecommunication means, it's a more cultural phenomenon. So in this case, we need to give a certain theory to this phenomenon. I would like to be short here. Let's have a look at the culture existing in three axes. First, knowledge, values, and regulator. Knowledge is a cognitive axe, the values is our mind axe, and the regulator is a legal axe. And if you look at these axes create different cultures, social cultures, which is created by the knowledge and regulate. The next one is a mind culture, that was created by values and knowledge. It was very schematical to look at the culture, because the culture is an essential part of the human development in comparison to the other natures. Here we have to ask the question, why our phase of the human development is different from the other phases. I would like to express my own experience, because every platform has its own trends, because trends are kind of a negative word. There is a certain paradigm that also existing in our transition from the post-industrial society. In the scientific culture, there is a trend, data-intensive science. I don't want to translate it into Russian because in order to not to get the people confused. And this is a situation when we start learn the reality in a different way. Certainly there is a theory and empiric mean of studying. Some years ago we got a computer science when we started using some mathematic models to study the nature, and the Microsoft company says that now we are in the paradigm of science, because we don't need to study anything. We just need to create the social networks and collect data and analyze them. That's all we need to do, because today's people are people in telecommunication. Today, not a professor decides everything. Probably a TV preacher can decide everything. However, the people are in a communication world, and who is in this communication world have a better influence. I think it's quite sad, but as a matter of fact, the second trend, which is much more important for us, is actually in our mind culture, what Anna already said, and I would like to give a certain theoretical shape to it. This is a personal identity online, which is actually what is called in English. Normally it is an identification of people through the passport data and so on. For me it is quite important to find a very fundamental part of this situation, the personal identity online. This actually is a shaping of a person in new circumstances. As a kind of information space that also exists parallel to people. That's a knowledge about us. If someone died in the past, that was the end for him, because a couple of generations were able to remember him, and the information space exists together with a human, with an individual, and doesn't die with his death, because there are some sensitive things they also remain and can be used, and it can also change our opinion not only about the past but also about the future. The information space allows us to do it. And the personal identity online exists differently than in reality, and have to recognize it, have to understand it, and also give a certain legal framework to it. The third trend relates to the social culture, and is more interesting for us within our discussion, because the modern information technologies were built after nothing has changed during the last 300 years in the industrial economy, and all the information technologies we knew, these were information technologies of the industrial society, and now we are transit to a new phase of post-industrial society, and all these technologies are becoming network and web technologies, and all the criteria should be changed. It doesn't mean that we should also bury all the law that existed in the past, but it is not the right concept. But you have to understand that the people are different now. For example, I don't know, do we celebrate the foundation of the Pravda newspaper? Because Pravda newspaper had a very great influence and brought the October Revolution of 1917 to the success. We know the influence of this newspaper on the public opinion. It was quite big democracy in Russia at the moment, and the foundation of this Pravda newspaper was a very huge impact on the old Tsar regime. But now it wouldn't work, because even the very popular country leader wouldn't be able to influence on the public opinion through the broadcasting. how it was started in 1917. It won't work in Egypt, in Tunisia. So no leader is possible to bring people on the streets, because in internet people are living in a very sensitive life, because they communicate with the people thinking in the same way. If some leader will ask you to come out of and and protest on the street, and if your friend in a Facebook makes the same, you can believe him and you will go out on the street and protest. And this web man is in the center of our attention. So I just wanted to describe these three trends and actually finish my short speech.
Thank you very much. And I believe our further discussion will be built on the discussion of the context that Ilya provided. But we believe that it's better to have Q&As in order to work out a common opinion or contrast different opinion. But why we needed such a powerful abstract forward? We needed that to show how fundamental are the changes that occur in the model world, applicable to ITs and network technologies, and what is the role of law in this context. Because quite often we perceive legal reality separately from IT reality. Some very important processes are taking place. We understand their importance, but as soon as we start a legal discussion, people go back to the epoch of reason, epoch of enlightenment, and start to think in terms that no longer regulate the relationships in the real world. I would express my deepest gratitude to Ilya for raising the issue of the revolutionary situation of 1917. That was a good example of how the authorities tried to regulate the public relations without taking the reality into account, how the censorship tried to regulate major printing house, forgetting about the circulation of simple sheets like the Iskra and the Pravda newspapers, which impacted the change in the society. We are not going to discuss the politics, but the social sphere is just as important for economy, for social life in different areas. For instance, the department headed by Nikolai Kartashov is focused on managing information exchange to promote commercial products, the Department of Advertisement and the Department of Fighting Unfair Competition. But it's an interesting question whether our colleagues take into account that social networks become means of manipulation, become means of selling people false products in under the disguise of a friendly advice. And I would like, unless you object, to pass the floor to another person who knows the situation from inside. He knows the social networks, how they live, how they develop. And as a young entrepreneur, he set up several businesses based on social networks and new communications means to promote goods and services. Martin Adams, the UK and the US. Martin, if you can speak about your view of the changes of the situation inside, how the law can subtly react to those processes. What are we missing? What are we losing now? Why, talking about these problems today, we really feel that the law is lagging behind? Well, your vision of that.
Thanks very much for the introduction and the kind words. So, as Alexei said, I was there kind of, I guess, riding the crest of the wave of social media as a student, and started up a business that basically, when I was using social media, I was seeing the kind of the data that was being put across it. it was a new phenomenon, and people were, as they still are to a certain extent, but even more then, they were using it without really regard for the potential dangers down the line with the data that they were passing on to these unknown entities. So, I mean, the way that a lot of social media marketing works, ours works somewhat to this extent, but there's a spectrum, of course. This was back in 2006 or so, but there was a lot of deceptive practices on social networks. There was a lot of use of fake profiles, so whereby brands, this was all really generally an attempt for brands, typically vertical monologue speakers who don't engage in peer-to-peer conversation, don't engage in dialogue, don't engage in conversation, which is what we regard as the hallmarks of peer-to-peer networks, social networks. This was all an attempt for brands to come onto a peer-to-peer platform. And they struggled to do that because they're used to vertical pitches. So they began to enlist people like myself to try and create a more social message for, particularly at the time, young users, but as time went on, a kind of plethora of different users, diverse users. And so the way that they would do that, there was, you know, a number of strategies. They, as I said, they might create fake profiles, populate those profiles with very accurate information, people's interests and likes and identities. I mean, we're talking really about platforms that are built around either, in my view, identity or interests. So at root level, if you're aware that that's how these communities organize, it's very easy to create a community around yourself. You become a kind of alpha in a society, in an online community. And then from there, you have a potential to basically give the brand's message, to endorse products, to push services, to like things, to comment on videos or on new services. I think one of the concerns, really, from a kind of policy perspective, I'm now a lawyer, so I've kind of left some of those dark days of behind. But some of the concerns, I think, are that really that recasts users who are, as I said, on a peer-to-peer basis, who believe that they are there. One of the unique things about social networks were that they were free from brand proliferation. So really, unwittingly and unknowingly, which is the most dangerous way, these individuals were being recast as consumers. They were being marketed to, pitched to, and those networks were being somewhat distorted. So that was historical. I mean, even in the kind of modern day, with my legal practice, I've been working with some companies, different companies with a range of sizes, from public companies down to smaller companies, that are pejoratively, I guess, called content farms. They create content that we would all digest on the web through YouTube or through more classic social networks, Facebook, Twitter, stuff that is either stuff that basically comes onto those social networks and that we consume. And a lot of it is marketed as and is presented as being, again, peer-to-peer. It's advice. It's websites similar to, ehow.com. These sort of, I'm going to give you some insight into the way that I garden, or the way that I fix a tire on my Ferrari, or if we have one, So again, beneath the veneer of what we find attractive about social networks, the idea of moving away from proprietary, market-based models of production towards something more community-oriented, and we look less at classic forms of intellectual property as being incentives to create content, and we look more at different motivations, the will and the potential, but also the ethic of sharing content, the ability to receive feedback, these motivations, which we would hope, and those are some of the things I think we're celebrating here, or we hope to celebrate here. I just want to point out that even now, beneath that veneer, there are companies, as I said, described as content farms, that will actually pay individuals to create such content. They're paid on classic, what we call in the US, work for hire arrangements, meaning that the IP is owned by the company. So we're really returning back to classic and, in my view, slightly unattractive, at least on these platforms, models. So those are some of the concerns. I mean, I've got some positives I'll bring up at some point, but I appreciate you want to keep things back and forth.
My question, you've been very general. Would the tendencies to describe be true, do you think, of the major? Oh, I'm sorry. My question is whether the practices you describe are only a sort of lower class of site, or whether they also include the more established players, Twitter, Facebook, the main players.
So certainly back in the day, so 5-6 years ago, they certainly did include, I mean, Facebook, for example. Facebook has taken, did take some positive steps, I think, more for its own commercial interests. It understood that it had to clean up these practices. So it became very strict in terms of fake profiles. It began to strike against and be very proactive in terms of targeting the companies who are creating what were called bots, essentially technologies, very simple technologies really, that enabled these fake profiles to add maybe thousands of friends a minute, to send friend requests, to really spam the networks. And so Facebook was proactive in targeting them. So I think there's certainly been an improvement. I mean, I'm a internet and social media optimist. I think that we shouldn't surrender the specific instances of examples I'm giving to the more general macro benefits in the abstract that these provide. It was more just to flavor the debate here today, to give some specific examples to hinge upon, but I do feel that these were universal concerns which operated across the major players, and there have been steps taken by those players. Though it's arguable that the form of the beast has changed from being social, from being social media entrepreneurs of the sort of caliber I was, out of university. Maybe now that the major platforms' interests have changed because they have much more significant, commercial parties that they stand to benefit from relationships with. So there are still concerns with, very dramatic, there are still concerns with any brand presence on a social network more generally.
Yes, actually, I think this is extremely interesting, what Martin was mentioning before, in particular relating to stories of companies that would try to use the social media and somehow be intruders to this peer-to-peer type of process. And I tried to think about if, of course, I mean, we can ask questions, this is a positive thing, and should we protect basically consumers? Is there a case for that? But before actually arriving to this question, I would like to think a little bit how this integrates into the way companies think about their branding and they develop their branding policy. I think traditionally the idea of branding was very hierarchical, in the sense that the company management was basically trying to create an image, their brand, and then serve it to the public. And I think recently, and has been quite substantial literature on that, we can see a form of two-way process. The companies actually, they try to be in a direct contact with their users and together, let's say, in a hierarchical way, somehow create the brand and create the personality of the brand. And I think from that perspective, a peer-to-peer process or the social network process is a very efficient way to do that, because it's a way actually to be in communication with your user and with your client and frame together, let's say, the image of the brand. And I think, you know, we shouldn't see that as a negative thing only. I mean, maybe as an evolution of branding somehow. And I just wanted to raise this particular point.
Я хотела бы еще узнать, может быть, мнение...
I wanted to find the opinion of Nikolai Kartashov as the representative of the Anti-Monopoly Service, who is responsible for the advertisement market, because the issue that we've been discussing is really very interesting, because like we said, the so-called false personality is possible on the web, and that false personality will impact the opinion of the members of that community, and that is certainly used in the for commercial purposes. What do you think about that? Well, you see, our opinion of that problem, although it's difficult to call that a problem, in our opinion, the problem does not exist, at least in Russia. That is my personal opinion. More than that, I would like to say why the web is famous, why is it good, why is it attractive? It's open and it provides freedom. What does it take from us? How does it capture us? The opinions that the users disseminate in the network. You see, from the standpoint of the FAS, this is a very complex problem. It's very difficult to prove where a personal opinion ends and where the advertisement starts. Of course, you could identify a false profile that, for instance, a person has created several profiles from one IP address, but we didn't have any instances of that so far. But you know, the opinion of the Anti-Monopoly Services, we're a very liberal agency, and we interfere into the market relationships exclusively when there is a problem emerging. When the problem has emerged, the businesses address us. They tell us they have problems. They ask us to help, and we have had no applications so far, maybe because we don't have much of that. This tendency is not very much developed in Russia, maybe for technical reasons, because not everyone in Russia has the web, has the internet connection, and the country is not limited to St. Petersburg and Moscow. Maybe because of that. But again, look, from the standpoint of law, such advertisement is not legally prohibited as of now. It's not legally prohibited by law. It's not seen, it's not perceived as advertisement. Thank you very much. Our representative, Tim Wool from the United States, would like to express his opinion and present their view of that problem. Microphone.
So, hi everybody. Good morning. I worked for some time at the American version of the Consumer Protection Agency, the Federal Trade Commission, one whose main job is to, well, a couple of jobs, antitrust and advertising regulation. And we have brought many cases against these kind of behavior you're talking about. And I would say the approach we took targets what we call deceptive advertising. And we consider it deceptive when someone is not making it clear that they're delivering an advertisement, that it's paid for. So, for example, let's say you think we're friends. It turns out I'm not really friend, but I've been paid by Megaphone or something to be your friend or something. Sorry. And then I keep saying, I got a good idea. Maybe you need maybe we need a new cell phone, and your old one's no good, and blah blah blah. So this was the line that if you're actually advertising, but you're posing as non-advertising, that this is a violation of federal law. And we punish this quite harshly. I'll give one example. Yahoo, which everybody knows was predecessor to Google. It used to be that Yahoo, if you paid them money, would give you a higher search ranking. So you did a search, and you maybe would search for car, and you get Ford or something, or Lada, I don't know, local example. And they were taking money for this, but they weren't making it clear they were taking money for this, and that we ruled was illegal. That we said was false advertising. And so what we've required, if you've ever done a search on Google, you notice you have the results, and then you have advertisements, and it says advertisements. If you look on Facebook, there's an area, and it says advertisements. Sometimes you read a magazine, and you're reading, and all of a sudden it starts talking about, it looks like news, but it says advertising on top. That's all because of the agency saying you must be clear what's advertising and what's not. And the practices you're talking about are a violation of that law in the United States. I'm sure the case will come to Russia soon.
Теперь российская...
Now I would like the Russian part to give an answer to what you said. I just wanted to draw attention to what Timothy Wu said, because confusing people through advertising should be limited or even banned, because in Russia we're not so far in regulating, because the Russian law doesn't recognize such a phenomenon in Russia. But for good competition, it is a very important aspect, because social networks have more influence than the central television we used to watch in the past or other traditional media, including the Pravda newspaper or other magazines and papers. You're welcome. I've got a feeling that our wing, our right wing, we don't want to fly away, because now in the first past we are going to talk about more abstract things, and we'll also touch upon the history. I would like to keep the line in comparison to the left wing that speaks about practical things. I would like to go back to the first topic. That's the evolution of human values in the internet time. I would like to express probably my thoughts to this topic and start with the historical aspect, because my attitude to the web and internet and to the portals in the internet, because I consider these networks as a way of organizing the society, and evolution is happening now and here, and this evolution is happening very fast. I would like to compare the evolution of attitudes in the internet networks with the evolution of relationships in the mankind. If you remember the organization of the society since the first stage of the human development, it was the family, then it was in the ancient time, then the family turned to a bigger family, then to a certain country, to a state, then we've got private property in the state. The same is happening in the networks with a much higher speed. We remember that the networks was found that as a student way of communication, then this network started acting in a certain country, then worldwide. I think this phenomenon can be considered as one of the ways for the human evolution of human relationships, certainly evolution of law, because law is a regulation of our public life. To achieve a certain balance in our relationships in order to protect one people from the influence of other. And our colleague from England said about it already, because family is a good thing. Because with the information exchange, opinions, ideas, we also get some negative things. It means that our life moves to internet as it exists in real life here. And then we can have a look how our real life was regulated in a historical aspect. In the beginning, it was not regulated at all. There was good and bad. Then, with the development of the society, we got some bans for certain types of behavior. Then we got the private property, and then we got the state and the regulation of the good exchange and turnover. The state starts regulating the human behavior. We get some regulating provisions, that means legislation. If we look at the internet evolution in this aspect, I would like to tell you that the network finished the first phase of the evolution very fast, and now in a phase when we can talk about certain limitations. I would like to split the life in the network in two parts. This is social life and business, because business is being done now through internet or through, because we've got a society of people united by common interests, and there are some other societies, business societies in the internet who are interested in supplying and consuming goods and services. There are a lot more complicated grading, but I'd like to split it just in two simple parts. If we speak about the relations in the social area, so in the comparisons from the real life, there are some significant differences from this real life. In the real life, the publicity is connected with the fact who is acting publicly, because you can see a certain person expressing his own ideas. We can also teach how to commit a suicide or some really other bad things. But in a virtual life, we have a publicity, but we always difficult to identify for us who is this public person. So this person is anonymous, and we understand the bad things should be limited. The people's rights should be protected. How can we do if this activity is anonymous? And yesterday we were discussing whether it was needed to regulate the internet or not, but I think we don't really need to regulate the internet and common things, but this deviant behavior should be under control, and we have to start with the bans as it was in history. I don't know whether it is bad or good. We are discussing now not the need of banning this freedom of speech in internet or not, because now we are giving an assessment of this. I think we have to leave this discussion behind, because this discussion is quite personal for everyone here. This is actually the control in internet is a kind of invasion of private life of everyone. Let's look at this topic more abstract. What do we see? Even in our panel, there are different interest requests from different people of different age. Alexei and me, when we were preparing for this round table, we discussed, because if we ask around the generation of our parents how they are ready to let the social networks come into their life, they would normally say they wouldn't agree to let anybody in from the internet. And for us, it's actually every day's life. Some of you may be less involved in these processes, but if we ask the generation of our kids, they don't really understand that there is a kind of closed environmental space, because they were born with these internet societies. And if we, from our position, or from the position of people who grew up in a different reality, would try to identify what is good or bad in internet, we will come to a no way out situation. And I'm absolutely sure what our international colleagues are saying here. It is quite important to point out here that internet is quite good. If it is, we should be honest. If it is an advertisement internet, it should be also identified as an advertising. If it is an artificial profile, we should also know that this profile is not real. If there is someone collecting people to protest on the street, we should also understand what this person is and what he is intending to do. So every user has a right to receive an open information. This is actually to be honest, in the internet, it is quite important. And there are other countries who have been living with internet for longer than Russia, so we have to protect the openness of the information in internet. I'd like to give floor to Mikhail. So we'll give the floor to Mikhail to express his own comments, because he is representing a social network in Russia. For our Mail.ru is one of the largest social networks in Russia. It was one of the first fast-developing networks here in the country. There is another, even older social network. Dear colleagues, I would like to commend the last words of our moderator about the fundamental differences. I absolutely agree with everything what was said, but we are here at the legal forum, and I'd like to tell you more about the legal aspect. But in reality, there is a fact that we need to overcome. It doesn't matter whether we work in internet or not. It's a question of trust to law. When there is a certain legal conflict abroad in other countries, what a normal judge tries to do, what actually the reason for the court decisions in abroad, that's why this judge looks at all the circumstances. And if there is a law that also confirms the judge's opinion, the judge can use this law that he also studies all the evidences and proofs brought by the parties, so every case can be studied on the merits and a good decision can be taken. Probably it's a Russian or a Soviet tradition, and it is quite bad now in Russia, because the Russian judge looks first at what law is existing now and applies the law. But if the law is stupid, but it is actually stipulated in the law, unfortunately the law will be applied. But in case there is no law, and the legal relationships are quite new, and the judges are getting lost, and we can look at the controversial court practice in England. It is quite normal that you can brought an SMS as an evidence in court, but how can you provide an electronic document for a certain transaction, even if it was signed digitally? But I do really hope that the development of new technologies will contribute to the update of this paradigm of thinking, that the the law abroad is something what really works and can. But in Russia, law is something what is written on a paper but is not really applied in a way that can also serve people. And what I wanted to say in the beginning, because we as lawyers have to understand what is the definition of the social networks, because legally it's a very sensitive thing. We are talking about different things with different processes. For example, if we call Facebook odnoklassniki.ru, vk.com as social network, and LiveJournal what it is, or what is Twitter, or for example the Echo of Moscow Society or authors of Wikipedia, what these portals are, because it's a different actual legal events, and we have to understand clear how to classify them. And the last thing, I was always absolutely against the fact that when the social networks are developing without a legal framework, it is not a matter of fact. Facebook has almost 1 billion people as users. Probably it's the third largest country in the world. For about 1 billion citizens of Facebook have their own legal standards, and the Facebook users have a right to either to agree with these standards or become a Facebook user, or not to agree with these standards, not to be the Facebook user. How can we? Certainly, it is needed to cooperate in a normal way and stop regulating in incorrect way. I don't want to call name Megaphone. I will take Skylink. The Skylink, when it's another cell operator providing you an access to certain social network from to vk.com. This is also a legal relationship, and certainly you can it is legally, but there is another problem of cross-border law. But Mikhail, I would like to dispute with you. Every country, if it is not only wants their citizens to take part in creating the legislation, because the Facebook, Google, and other companies, they created their own standards, and if you accept the standards of this virtual country, or if you don't accept these rules and standards, it is not democratic. And in this connection, I have a question to you and to our international colleagues. Before we start talking about the creation of legal rules and standards, can we say that we've got new social relationships in the social networks? What is the difference between the LiveJournal and the Union of Writers? What is actually the Facebook different from our roundtable? Do we have any new social relationships in the internet and social networks, or these are still the same relationships but in another environment? I would like to give you a quick example. Certainly, you are right that these are new legal relationships, and the question of identifications are good examples of it, because
there's a number of new resources where identity is mandatory. Facebook is a vivid example of that. When you violate the user's agreement, if you introduced yourself by false name or created a fake account, you're out. Then there's a number of social networks are populated by people who do not exist in reality, but the issues here is the responsibility for false identification. Whether this behavior is legal, if it violates rights of the third parties. There is no law on that, and it must be drawn, it must be developed. And certainly we have to delay between cases when identification is mandatory and when it is not. As applicable to Russian cell operators, the users always must have a user's agreement, and they must be identified in that agreement. And one other problem, which was also mentioned, the responsibility of operators for disclosure of personal data. Is a fake account personal data? Can you be responsible for disclosing any information? Well, say reprinting some pictures of photos, reposting some photos that were placed on the web by a person that doesn't exist, and that may violate someone's rights. And is the operator responsible for disclosing the personal data? And these problems will ever aggravate. I would like to pass the floor to my left, the people who represent, or to Tim. Dmitry.
Raised some very good issues, a good question, and I suppose I am more in agreement with you. I think that while the manifestations may change, the tools, the software has changed, I think some of the underlying concepts are still the same. Behind all these computer screens are humans, ultimately, flesh and blood. And it's not as if deception is something new. People have been lying for millions of years. And so, you know, the concept of deception and fraud is nothing new. I mean, probably 400 years ago, somebody was selling you a fake, I don't know, sheepskin or something. You know, so this has always been going on, and I agree. There's this, with some sympathy, it's very difficult sometimes to adapt to the new context. But I don't think the old concepts are useless. And this was my discussion of what we've been doing in the United States with false advertising. You know, we didn't hesitate and say, oh, there's this thing called a social network, there's Twitter. We just ignore all that stuff, and we ask the question, is there deception here or not? So we return to the old questions, the old concepts, and ask, is there harm going on here? Is someone being hurt? I want to respond to one other thing that you said. I think you said, I'm not always sure, the translation. You were talking about the trans-jurisdictional issue, you know, the multi-country issue. And I think that is an important point. Some of our discussion here, we can talk as much as we want about Russian regulation. In America, we talk as much as we want about American regulation. But the fact is the European Union decides most privacy questions for the whole world. They just do, because they have the strictest standards and they have strong enforcement. And so, in fact, as the reality, Facebook, Apple, Google make their products in compliance with European law. And so we can talk forever, but really it's Europe that's deciding for us.
Да, вот аспект
Yes, the European Union aspect. The European Union aspect should be discussed here, because what the European Union faced when it developed their law on the protection of personal data, because it's a conglomerate of countries, and trans-border issue is quite different for them. Well, the US is the most progressive country internet-wide. Russia is the biggest country in the world territory-wise, and the trans-border issues is something like a postponed problem for us. For European Union, it's a real problem, a current problem, and when they enacted that law on the personal data protection, they faced a situation whereby the countries of European Union were applying those standards quite differently. And current directives are intended to minimize that applicability or application differences, and probably they will be able to comment on that.
Probably first like to comment on the previous speaker's points, and then I will turn to the European Union's privacy policy. I think the point we raise is a very important one, which is, you know, should law intervene in this particular type of setting, the IT social relation type of issue? And I would say that your point, if I understood it correctly, was that, well, we have, let's say, contract law, which should apply in this case. It is a standard contract, you accept it or not. You have to read the conditions and terms. Once you do that, then basically contractual freedom applies, and obviously you cannot come and say anything about it. And in a way, this is, you know, a particular point we can defend. Now, the thing is that the assumption of contract law is basically an assumption of equality. And if we look to contract law, somehow the idea is that contract law is trying to regulate this inequality of partners. And somehow with a number of compulsory conditions that apply and that protect the general interest, which is the fact that there should be, everyone should actually be free to decide and no power should be exerted. Now, the fact that in standard contracts, which are basically contracts between parties with very unequal power, we have moved towards like consumer protection laws, which are basically pushing forward the contract law framework towards a kind of more compulsory setting protecting public interest in this case. This is actually, this comes from the fact that there is a recognition that there is an equality of power between the different partners. And obviously, this is something that is magnified in the case of social networks because these are networks, so they have more people. You know, we're talking about 800, 900 million individual contracts there with one. I mean, it's a huge issue of power here, which I think leads to apply consumer protection law, but also, you know, antitrust, as we're going to see later, etc. Now, the question then we have to ask, you know, basically here the failure, let's say, you know, will have been the market failure. I mean, I would like maybe use this term, would be that the fact that there's maybe an asymmetry of information between Facebook that has to deal with 800, 900 million consumers, and basically they have already, you know, they have very low fixed costs in putting together, you know, this kind of standard contract, and then the ability of each individual consumer to somehow spend time and effort in reading this particular contract. So, I mean, that creates some form of asymmetry of information, and this is basically why, you know, we regulate that particular thing. Now, and I think it's always important to think about what is a failure, what is the externality that we're trying somehow to correct by regulating in this particular case. And there are different types of externalities. Now, the privacy issue is obviously different. Doesn't relate to consumer protection at all. And there is more the idea that, and in Europe, this is how we perceive it, it is a fundamental right. There is a fundamental right for privacy, which is basically included in our constitutive treaties. You have Article 8 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which is a binding document. This is actually our Bill of Rights, which proclaims the right to privacy. And you have also Article 16 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union that provides competence to the EU to act in terms of privacy protection. So we have, let's say, this particular setting, you know, in terms of competence for the EU to act in this case. Now, in 1995, the EU has adopted a directive with the objective to harmonize, let's say, the laws, the existed laws in some member states on privacy, but also basically creates a right to privacy in other member states that did not have this before. This particular directive was very much pushed by Germany at that particular time, in particular, let's say, a couple of academics in Germany, in the Frankfurt Law School, that were basically writing on privacy issues for a long time. Now, what is interesting now is that in 1995, we didn't really know much about social networks. I mean, it was really like extremely, like, you know, it's very old for an IT perspective. And there was a feeling that this particular framework did not succeed in somehow unifying and harmonizing the different case laws and implementation measures by the different member states. Because if you have a directive, member states are free somehow to implement and transpose a directive, but in their own way. So they can still, you know, have some particular differences in their implementation. That's why the Commission has recently, in January 2012, proposed a new, let's say, framework which is going to be even more binding than the previous one because this framework will be based on a regulation. A regulation is a binding instrument of law that applies directly to every individual and every company which is having to deal with Europe. I mean, it has actually sales or anything in Europe. So, and that does not leave member states some leeway in implementing it because it's a directly applicable measure. Now, this particular regulation brings a number of interesting points. In particular, I think somehow it has to be seen as a reaction to this evolution towards like the social networks and IT problems, social network problems that have been created by, in particular, the sudden change of policies, of privacy policies by Google, which also, you know, were issues that were raised in the United States as well. And I think here what is interesting is that this regulation is creating a reinforced right to be forgotten somehow, the ability to delete data and to manage basically data. Secondly, it provides very explicitly that consent should be given explicitly rather than assumed in terms of data use. It creates, let's say, it reinforces the national data protection authorities, which somehow can intervene even if the data was made public in another jurisdiction, and even if this other jurisdiction was outside the EU. So in a way that creates an extraterritoriality of EU privacy law, because once you have some form of data distribution outside the EU that affects someone in the EU, that obviously immediately, it's kind of an effects doctrine from the point of view of international law. So I think, and obviously at the same time, there are a number of sanctions that have been established, which can go up to €1 million or even 2% of the global turnover of the company in case of a breach. So you can see that there is a really rather reinforced legal framework for data protection, which, and I agree, because of the extraterritoriality effect, that will be somehow the world standard in this particular case.
A brief response. The colleague pronounced a phrase which describes the new things. Yes, there is a right to be forgotten. No offline legal system includes that or even mentions that. With the appearance of social networks, there is a new human right which needs to be institutionalized. The right to be forgotten, the right for the data to be deleted, the right for oblivion is a new legal institution. I would like to comment on that. I started speaking about the difference in percepting what we call law, and that is a big problem. Our foreign colleagues, especially in the Anglo-Saxon system, the law is what we called justice. For our Russian officials, the law is a regulation that has been passed by the State Duma and that has been enacted as a regulation. Whereas the law, and that is taught at the universities and schools of law, is a wider perception, is a wider concept, which does not only boil down to what's written on paper. There are other regulations, for instance, contractual law. The Internet provides us with a new sphere of regulation, which we called technical regulation. This is no longer a law, but the standards applicable in the Internet, if the users do not follow those regulations, nothing happens. And then the regulation takes place not at the level of contractual norms, but at the RFC level. And that's a quite different mechanism. It's not a legal mechanism, but it's still very efficient. And as for the trans-border issues, that's a very burning issue. Facebook is an American company. The Odnoklassniki is formerly a Russian organization that works throughout the Russian-speaking world. The issue of trans-border transmission of personal data is a global problem. My friend who lives in the US is a client of a small bank which is in the state of New York, and he had a small problem that he wanted to solve. He called the bank, he called the technical support service, he heard a voice with a strong Indian accent, and he understood that everything that the call center of that bank was in the south of India, because that's much cheaper than keeping the support service in the US. And he recalled that he never authorized anyone to pass his account data to another country, especially to India, and I think those problems will ever multiply. Mikhail, well, I'm afraid something will do bodily harm to me. In what sense are we talking about the right for oblivion? It's a good slogan, it's very populist, but how do you provide that technologically in the current world and in the future world? Of course you could do that through, well, you could reduce the accessibility of data through laws or through regulations, forbidding a player to index something, but how do we provide that right to be forgotten? Is that rhetoric? It is unlikely that we will be able to practically implement this principle, because the information that is once circulated will probably remain in the network. It would be more difficult to find it after an appropriate court ruling, but it will still be available. Yeah, a spoken word remains there. Yeah. You know, how do we seriously discuss the implementation of that right? May I intervene with a couple of words about the technological possibility to implement that right to be forgotten, to bring down the discussion from high-level legal issues to practice. We had a case that our SMS users were on the web last year. Well, they read all the messages. There was a lot of personal information there. Fortunately, there was no personal data, but nevertheless, those SMS messages got there because the Yandex engine, search engine, processed this information in such a way. The search engine was tuned in such a way that it, well, there's always a developer of that software.
because social reform requires competence is clear.
Примерно то, когда вы свой автомобиль передаете человеку, который
Case
не
when
имеет прав
you have a
водить.
car, even if you are a car owner, you
Можно
give
перед
your
тем, как
car to
передадим
drive to
слово
anyone without a driving license. I would
сказать,
like
я
to
тоже
give
маленький
word to
вопрос
Tim to
комментарий на эту
answer this
тему.
question.
Вот насчет
Before I give
анонимности,
a
не
small
анонимности. Мне кажется, это
commentary
очень
on
интересная проблема в
anonymity or
контексте
non-anonymity, because
обсуждения
it's quite
двух разных
interesting.
моделей развития сети интернет. Мы говорили сети социальные, которые
Talking about the social
сформированы, они
net
создали ли что-то новое? Вы сказали, главное новое, то,
these
что мы хотим,
networks created
по
anything
сути,
new. The
избавить сети от анонимности.
most important new
Но ведь если вы хотите
is
избавиться от
actually
анонимности
to
через введение
eliminate the
института
anonymity
забвения,
in the
что есть,
network.
в
We
общем-то,
like to
в некотором
introduce
смысле
the
авторитарный способ управления
institute of
системой, да, то есть когда вы всю систему
forgetfulness.
подвергаете некой ревизии
In
и
this case, you
вот этот весь
revise the whole system
дизайн этой системы таким образом
and
перестроить, чтобы
change
можно
the
было выпустить
design of the whole
информацию
system
отовсюду,
in order to
где бы она
get
ни
access
существовала.
to any
Соответственно,
information
если вы хотите изменить, по
available
сути,
in the
технологию,
web. If
то
you want to
реагируете ли вы тем
change the
самым
technology,
адекватным
do you
образом на то
react
новое, что
in
приносит
a
эта технология?
adequate
То есть
way
технология
on the
принесла вот
innovation?
этот новый формат взаимодействия людей. То, что не существует в реальном жизни, в реальном мире. В реальном мире мы, в общем-то, всегда можем проследить, что
Well,
происходит.
what doesn't
Ну,
exist in
если
the
не говорить про службы.
world, we,
Да,
because in the real world we
если говорить,
cannot
вот
track
не хотим ли
what
мы тем самым бороться с технологией, а
I
не
said,
наоборот
what
трансформировать наши
do
социальные отношения с
you
технологией?
want actually to
Нужно
transfer
это
our
вместе, прежде чем...
the relationships in different?
Тем более, пока коротко скажу,
I would like to
что
be
я ни
short.
разу не говорил о своем личном
I've never talked about my personal attitude to what is happening. I only pointed out problems, and I would like to tell that these problems are existing in reality, and they should be focused. And I agree with Mikhail, but right, a full forgetfulness is not about the whole internet, about the accounts in the social networks. When certain user left a social network, this nation should be excluded from the social network. And here, and these problems are more important. It's quite more interesting to discuss them in comparison to what our politicians said. Say that we have to ban the Facebook in Russia because this is actually an initiative of the Department of State or from the United States, because the internet is a children pornography, and I think it is better to ban what the Russian politicians say. And there are a lot of legal, interesting issues, and we have to concentrate on them and not on the political bullshit. I would like to say something else here. We said a lot about the anonymity in the internet and the social networks, and this is hypothesis that is existing, but I think it's just a hypothesis, because to provide a real anonymity in the internet is very difficult, because the cost for the anonymity is for a common user, or especially for a certain for terrorists, are quite significant, and even there is a real damage and real problems in the case of a real danger, the police are not able to are able to track who is behind a certain account in the internet, and when the problems are getting concentrated and a certain limit is overcome. When the children communicate among each other and they don't really understand who of their classmates wrote this or that, when this the anonymity doesn't exist in reality. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience, and then we'll ask our colleagues to comment with this right of forgetfulness. This is not a question, more just my opinion to the topic you discussed some minutes ago. It is needed. What is needed to be needs to be included into the legislation, because in Russia, I would like to dilute the theoretical part of the right wing. Is application of law in Russia. Not so long ago, we had a dispute in the court on the Brazil island, and the judge was asking a question how we informed the subscribers about our rates. And then we got a question from the judge, and then he asked us where the internet is located. The claimant was living in Brazil's island, and then we said that internet is also located in the Brazil island, and we were also afraid that the judge would ask us to show where exactly the internet is located in the Brazil's island, because the judges they normally resign is when they die, so they can stay forever. In this case, we need to regulate the situation somehow. Probably it's quite a funny thing for our international colleagues, but it's a real matter of things. It was a funny case, but we need to stipulate something for these old judges in the legislation. Otherwise, the court practice will be different from what is actually intended to be in it from the legislation. I would like to give a comment to anonymity from the Cliff Legal Company, because I'm responsible for marketing in the social networks. I would like to give you some cases from real life, because in the odnoklassniki.ru it is no way to delete the accounts completely. There was an employee of our company. He died 3 years ago, but I'm still getting proposals for friendship for the last 3 years. And we know he died 3 years ago, but the proposals to become friends are sent to me constantly. The question is, we can also get some other proposals and offers from these dead accounts. Who is going to be responsible, liable for sending this information? Because we can also listen to the European opinion in this area. Oh, you wanted to ask?
Sir, I just want to ask anything, a topic that the recent censorship regarding SOFA, named as SOFA and MOFA, what's the benefit? Yeah. SOFA, the censorship, internet censorship, recently it's adopted. So what's the advantages and disadvantages for that? Any kind of...
Давайте мы пока все-таки сконцентрируемся, мне кажется...
Let's concentrate about the right of forgetfulness, and then we will come over to the private questions. And I would like to apologize from the person asked the last question, but I would like to listen to the right of forgetfulness.
I think the right actually to a reinforced right to be forgotten, let's say. This is basically, I think the concept of this right is to help people to manage the data protection risks online themselves. I mean, this is kind of empowerment type of right, rather than obviously, something that is kind of completely unenforceable. So it's provide, let's say, the possibility to people to manage themselves and decide on their own what exactly will be the level of disclosure they will have concerning their data and transferability of their data. And I think that is something that can be dealt ex ante rather than ex post. I mean, if companies know very well that there is data to be forgotten, they can put in place the mechanism, the technologies to empower their users to do that. I mean, and I think that is a way to understand this particular right, but obviously can be completed by Martin. I think you raised a very important question, which is, it's good to have, I mean, we can think first, should law intervene here and say yes or no? But then the second question is, what is the adequate institution to enforce this particular law? And what you raise as an issue is that maybe, it's not sufficient to have like something in legislation, because courts might not be, journalist courts might not be able to enforce it, might not have the knowledge and the expertise in this particular case. So that's actually why you might probably think, if you have a lot of cases that justify the expenses, you might think of putting in place a regulator, a specialized regulator, like basically this is a European model. The Data Protection Agency regulator who will somehow continuously supervise this particular industry. And I think that it can be justified by the number of cases you might have, and also the lack of expertise of the courts. And maybe, that's something, I don't know exactly the situation in Russia, if you have a data protection, a privacy protection agency, but this is something you might probably think about.
Go ahead.
Just to follow up on what Yanis was saying, so I mean, in the US, there are kind of some examples of that sort of empowerment of the individual user. So I think it's right to say that it doesn't always need to be looked at retrospectively in terms of elimination, looking back of someone's online identity, but also the ability to say from this point forward, I wish not to be tracked. So the kind of do not track technologies that are being touted in the US are interesting from that perspective. So yeah, just to really flesh that out as a possibility.
Can I, if I could speak on right to be forgotten. By the way, I feel like things have gotten very lively in here. I think maybe the circle is a good idea. It creates a network feeling, friendly kind of thing. So right to be forgotten is extremely unpopular in the United States and very unpopular among American tech companies who see it as, I think, basically saying what you say, it's infeasible, impossible, technologically silly, European. Personally, I have a different opinion. I kind of like it, and I don't have any good reason I like it. I just think I would like it to be forgotten. I don't like having strange pictures of me everywhere, and I think most people have, I think most people have this instinct. They'd like to have a sense they would feel more comfortable that way, and I think ultimately technology should only serve human ends. What are we building these things for? Not, for companies. We're building it for humans, and if people like it, let them have it. As to the point that, well, how is it feasible? Well, it'll never be perfect. There's no chance that it's going to be perfect. No one thinks that you're going to have this law and all of a sudden, but the truth is no law is perfect. We have a law that makes it illegal to murder people. People are still getting killed. We have a law that makes it illegal to rob a bank. People still rob banks. The fact is, yeah, here we go. Well done. Thank you, Anna. I also think the window open has made people more lively. When it's too hot, it becomes, like a banyan or whatever. It becomes like our panel yesterday reminded me of banyan, except for without the beating. What's that? Different kind of beating, more a spiritual style. So, yeah, I like it, and I think law serves human ends. And yes, many companies complain it will not be perfect, but no law is perfect. But the question is, does it help a little bit? And you have something in terms of how it operate. Question of best efforts. Did you try? Do you have a system that is designed to do this? And if not, did you run the system well, or was it negligent? These are the kind of standards you have. You don't have a strict liability system. You have a negligence system. You run a best efforts, industry standards. So I like it. And there was some other point. Oh, yeah, the main thing is that American tech companies don't like it, I think, because it costs them money to operate it, obviously. It would be annoying to them. And it's when they lose someone, they lose all this valuable information. And their asset is big data, is information. So they don't like it because it costs them money. But frankly, they're making a lot of money off of us. Facebook is about to IPO today, $100 billion, based on my information. I ain't getting any of that. I've been bought and sold. We all gave them our stuff. I have no sympathy for the increased cost of this thing. I mean, give me a break. Number one. And number two, yeah, it's basically that I think that's all. They're not in danger of going bankrupt at any time, and they have very few regulatory constraints, and so I support it. And I stand very differently than most of my American colleagues who take your view and don't support it.
Just a question. Do you know the profitability? How much, what is the profitability? The average one of the social media companies?
А вот что касается компаний, которые занимаются социальными сетями, насколько они устойчивы? Could you what is actually the level of profitability of the social media? Are they profitable? Just so we are starting a kind of economic forum here. Now I can also give you a short answer. There are different social media networks. If you are talking about the IPO of a very well-known social media, certainly profitability is quite high. The company covers some annual incomes, but how it is actually deals with the real efficiency of the company, it is a different question. In Russia, all these large social media are profitable, but they have profits from different sources. They get money from selling gadgets, from games, advertising, and the proportion is different, but all social media are profitable now in Russia. But I can tell you that there is a situation. The smaller the social media is, the more economic problems it has, but it has also some other funding sources and has also some other objectives to fulfill. So it's quite short what I wanted to tell you. The try to discuss in an abstract way was not very successful. I would like to come over to very practical things concerning the questions we discussed here. The right to be forgotten doesn't exist. There are some natural rights of a human, right to live, right to die. If we're talking about the right to be forgotten, we should ask ourselves, and Tim said about it, it is quite difficult to implement. It's not really feasible, because who is going to correspond this right? Does this correspond, has the responsibility to implement this right at a certain operator? And it is a question of regulation. When Mikhail says that it is not important to focus on anonymity, because we can overcome this anonymity if it is needed, but we have also well-known anonymous hackers. They also broke a lot of databases and networks, and nobody managed to do anything with them. In this connection, I think we need also some cross-border efforts, and it's also a question of regulation, how to cooperate among the countries. And as answering the question of Dmitry, because Facebook is in a separate country, and if Facebook offers its own contract, it's a strong party in this contract, and the rights of a weak party of a consumer are not protected. Is also a question of law, a question of regulation. I would like to compare the situation with our market, because we at the cell operator have our own rights, and the regulator set the general principles that should be implemented in our rules. So the consumer has a right to sue that some of the rules or provisions do not correspond to legislation in a certain country. But in the social media we have the cross-border situation, when we can use our own mechanism. We can sign an international agreement among different countries about the general principles of behavior, and these principles should be accommodated in all the rules of the social network operators, and citizens may know these principles, and the operator, when they create their own rules, can use these principles. And with the social media, we have a group of countries. We need to prove the rights of a weak party, and it will be the situation we really want. This is actually one of the options how to resolve this collision.
Well, first of all, the notions of justice are quite different. It's unjust to establish justice based on some arbitrary criteria, and the people who select those social networks vote by their actions. They choose this, and we must respect their choice. They did not ask to protect them. We have never come across problems that demand a response. Yes, we did, because in the real world where we live, we also face crime. We cannot provide safety in the street. That doesn't mean that we will forbid people to come out in the street and make them sit at home. So the very principle that there is an anonymous group, so let's set the rules, is wrong. We will always have an indefinite number of problems that justify the necessity to regulate, but you don't do that. This is a wrong approach. You cannot think like that. You mustn't even say that. Well, Mikhail, since the discussion is becoming hotter, I will clarify. When we talk that there is an anonymous group and it must be regulated, I don't mean we should regulate members of that group. I mean the countries must come to an agreement how to look for those anonymous persons who inflict harm on others, because without interaction we will never be able to do that. Because all those anonymous persons are in different countries. You know, Ruslan, that reminds me of a discussion that people in Moscow always carry passports. No one does that in the US. Many people don't have a passport. So anonymousness on the web has all the features of anonymousness in real life. And if we are trying to transplant our Soviet legacy to American or European level, this will be ridiculous. And I believe that we must listen and learn about how we do not need to install imperative regulations if they harm people. And I think that is the purpose for this panel. Можно я? A couple of words. Mikhail and Ilya want to say a couple of words. Микрофон? Кто-то его взял? I will just say a couple of words about the international conventions and trans-border issues. Did they ask Facebook whether they were ready for the US government or the US administration to sign some international agreements on their behalf regulating their activities? Did they ask the Odnoklasniki whether they agree that a Russian functionary would go to international conference and sign conventions about regulating social networks? I believe they never asked them that. And I would like to look at how Facebook interacts with the US administration and whether they are in agreement or there are some issues in that relationship. And I can say quite for certain that as for the Facebook user agreement, the protection of personal data have been resolved more strictly than under the Russian law, except two issues. Not all of those rules have been translated into Russian, and another thing is that the trans-border problems have not been identified there. So if Facebook processes our personal data in India, we can't do anything with that. So I think we need to ask the networks themselves. I believe Leonis is wrong when he's saying that we establish European standards and regulations and rules and they will be universal. And that's a good example of Europe living in an ideal world, probably, but there's 1 billion people in India and 1 billion in China who look down on those European rules. And probably this trans-border agreements must be one of the tools to regulate those issues.
Basically, what I was saying, I was describing reality, which is that European Union law, and this is also a point Tim was making, because it actually imposes stricter standards, and because actually it has, it's extraterritorial. I mean, it's very clear in the regulation if it passes that this extraterritorial application. The problem you raised before, I mean, we cannot do anything in Russia if someone puts out data in India. in European Union law, you can apply extraterritorially the regulation, the European regulation. It is actually inside the regulation. So there is a stance of extraterritoriality. Now, obviously, that is an imperialist stance, a legal imperialism stance. And we can probably discuss about the weakness of Europe trying at the same time to also make it kind of being a bully in terms of privacy issues and apply extraterritorially, basically imitating the United States in other areas like antitrust, etc. And that brings the issue of international agreement. Maybe, a way to resolve these issues of extraterritoriality will be to have an international agreement where committee principles will apply, positive and negative committee principles. But in order to have this, you should have trust. The European, let's say, Europeans should actually have trust that the Russian authorities or the American authorities will actually take as seriously as they do privacy issues. And I'm not sure we are there yet. So if we're not there yet, Europe actually has to protect its citizens. And as long as the disclosure information is actually affecting European citizens, so it has an effect on Europe, Europe has to intervene in this particular case and even apply extraterritorially its legislation.
Do you mind if I... I've been thinking, this conversation is very interesting to me, and I thought I'd return to the topic of the Soviet Union and some of the Soviet thinking, and maybe it's dangerous because I don't really know this topic very well, but it's interesting to me. First of all, it strikes me that some of the concepts that the Soviets were interested, the Bolsheviks were interested in, are actually useful for understanding social networks software. The idea of the Soviets in some ways was to reprogram social relationships mostly along class lines to create unions between the workers and some of the divisions and so forth. And so there's some parallels in understanding the original ideas of the Bolsheviks and their ideas of a more horizontal society and less vertical society still have some relevance. There was a conversation earlier about whether law matters or whether the rules of Facebook matter for certain contexts. The gentleman over there was saying that, and it reminds me of the old difference between in the Soviet Union of the state and the party having their own separate types of rules. And so I think actually some of the original thinking is useful. One of the areas, though, I think maybe should be resisted, one of the later tendencies of the Soviet Union was this idea of central planning. Going to try to have these very long-term plans based on, this was in some ways, to my thinking, the weakness of the Soviet Union was that it tried to do everything according to a plan, a centralized plan, and sometimes the information was not adequate, and so therefore huge mistakes were made, and this was the problem with Stalin and among other problems. And I think that there's some danger of Russia following these tendencies when it comes to internet regulation. That is to say, have a sometimes weak idea of the not acting in too advanced a way. Hear about some problem and try to come up with a rule to solve it immediately, as opposed to waiting and seeing whether the problem is real, trying to understand the facts. I'm sorry if this is impolite to say, but sometimes I have felt over the last couple of days a tendency to hear about a problem and have a reaction immediately. And I think, often with some time you can see whether this thing is, I agree with what you were saying, you need to see whether there's a real problem here and slow down and find out whether anonymous actually does any harm or not, or whether it's sort of something people hear about and get excited about but actually doesn't do any real harm. So anyway, so some thoughts.
Можно я немножко...
May I shift gears a little bit? Russia has Federal Law 210. It's a law on state services, and there is a condition there that for the state services, the data that belongs to the local authorities are not demanded from citizens. So actually it is prohibited, and this regulation is already applicable to local authorities and municipal authorities, and it will be enacted in a few months. And the second part is that the regulation and the culture of handling personal data in Russian municipal and authority sectors is absent. And when we talk about social networks and disclosure of data and the right for oblivion, we mean Facebook, the Odnoklassniki, and other social networks. But there is another social network in Mikhail's list, the state, and all the complexity of the data that we provide to the state, whether we want it or not. Can we, in our country, hope that the data will be treated carefully? This is a general concern all over the world. And this problem is resolved more stringently in Europe, for instance, a prohibition for automatic processing of data, of personal data. A different method is applied in the US. In Russia, this culture is virtually absent, and Russia faces another phenomenon, and that is the black market of data. It exists, it has always existed. For people close to this or that official, this is a corruption mechanism, of course. So there's an ambiguous reality. This data is not available to ordinary people or to ordinary organizations, but there's a number of organizations. It's not necessarily a special service. It could be market players, market companies who have access to those data, who can compare those data and reach a market advantage using that. So, and this presents much more risks than is incurred by a private person, and it's not quite clear what to do with that, because briefly the problem boils down to the quality of management in Russia. And the second issue is that Russia has a very strong data centralization tendency, not through forming super bases, which was popular a few years ago. Now there's a new generation of IT experts who explain that this was not reliable, but this idea is implemented through providing all the data with unique IDs, similar for different databases at the disposal of different agencies. It could be an insurance number for private persons. It could be some different numbers for organizations, and that facilitates automatic processing of that data. And if we talk about Russia specifically, the greatest risks for our citizens are not related to social networks, but are related to the consequences of that exchange of data inside government agencies. So there's a problem of those problems are of different size, and probably this is Russian specific, but probably not. So the quality of state management, of governance, is very low. I think that very few people realize this problem. I'm a great champion of Law 210. I participated in its composition, and it really removes the burden from the citizens. But you must see the reverse side of that coin. And there is a presumption that this is right, that this is needed. And then we will probably come to understand this problem only in a few years. May I? I will provide a very brief transition a bit further, to move further away. Well, not very far away. We will come back to that. But
yeah, it's time for a break. We need our break. What do you think, Anna? I think we've had
one brief question for the discussion to have a logical continuation. To add to the discussion, Mikhail, in response to your first idea that a social network can be selected, can be chosen, and when you said that you should not prohibit a person from having a choice, don't tell him that we will choose for you. I agree in principle, but I do not agree in a specific life situation. Can a person really choose a social network when one social network has 900 million users. I'm registered in the VK.com, not because I need an interface. I'm registered there because there's a lot of people that I could not see and hear otherwise. There is a similar situation with the government. I cannot choose whether I have Moscovite's universal card or not. It will be imposed on me. So, because the government thinks everyone should have that card. But nevertheless, the main resource that the government has and that the Facebook and the VK has, this is the resource of the accumulated data. The accumulated data available for the company and the bank of accumulated contracts. And by limiting the dissemination, we strengthen the position of those organizations, and we guarantee that by prohibiting the disclosure of data by operated to other operators, or by prohibiting the government official to pass those data to public companies, we make them free from competition. Well, maybe the anti-monopoly committee will have an opinion on that. So do we oppose ourselves when we call for the personal data on the one hand, and on the other hand creating complex mechanisms for their proper use, and on the other hand caring about the person's comfort and about the person's choice? Because can we say that we provide a real choice for the people when technically they don't have it? And is it a value in the modern world, the world of total communication? Is personal life a value as we understand it? One small example from the recent past, when conversations by Boris Nemtsov with his friends were published. He said so many bad things about people, but no one even cared about that. He said, you know, but this is a telephone conversation. And in that sense, I don't really care about disclosing my information. I can really disseminate information about my mailbox. I don't really care about my personal information. But I'm worried if someone uses this information as a monopolist. Yes, I'm concerned about monopolization. If there's one operator, well, esteemed colleagues, this is a very important issue, and we will be discussing it in the second part of our discussion, because really this question has been formulated, and what's good about the European and American law is a possibility of transfer of profile and the turnover of your personal data as the subject of law. And this is the issue of marketing in anti-monopoly regulation and possibility to transfer your profile from Facebook to VK.com. To transfer pictures from one social network to another. This is a very important issue, how the monopolization of information and how fighting against closed systems is performed. We've already talked about that on the level of software when we discussed Microsoft, open source codes, etc. And we are approaching a similar situation when we have monopolization of personal data, and it is impossible to transfer them. I believe that everyone would like to speak about that. You all have an opinion on that, but I think that the format of this event dictates that we have a break for 15 minutes, and 15 minutes break, and then we will continue on this interesting topic.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are gonna resume our interesting roundtable, and we'd like to resume where we stopped. We will start discussing the second topic. We already started discussing it before the break, and this issue is connected with the data turnover. We will also discuss here some antitrust aspects. And as soon as our colleagues take their seats, we will resume where we stopped the discussion before the break.
Да.
And I would like to give the floor to the speakers of our panel to discuss the question of monopolization of personal data, how the personal data can be turned. I apologize. I would like to give some comment to what we discussed before the break, as I was waited for a long time. It was a question about the correlation between the real and social behavior. I would like to have a different look here. First of all, I would like to say something philosophical, because the social actual behavior or identifies the social mind, and the social media gives a new impression of this event when the virtual behavior identifies the social behavior, and the public mind consists of is being formed in the social networks right now. It's quite an important moment and have to take it into account. And the second one, we were talking about the legal regulation of a network. I would like to tell you about the network as a mean of forming and shaping the legal knowledge. The network gives a very significant opportunity for it, because I'm taking part in a project aimed at providing legal knowledge to users. It is clear that if you do know the legislation, it doesn't free you from the liability. And a project I'm taking part in, we do the full thing. If there is a spell check, if you write something, it can correct you, or any GPS navigator that can also direct you to right direction. That's actually the system we're working out. If, for example, if you write something to one of your user, you will be given a remark that actually will send you. For this, you can be sent to prison for 7 years, for example. Was just a recommendation. So out of the context, we can identify if it is legal or illegal. It's our quite a nice recommendation, a nice hint. It's a good news. What we can probably increase the legal knowledge of the population, but there is a bad news. It's a second side of the coin. Because the availability and no legal knowledge can lead to a certain nihilism when there is law and everything is going. This is the approach we normally use now in the current generation, how the current legal provisions and rules can regulate the new generation. This is a generation of nihilism, and this new generation can ask you and can also question all the truth. Do you remember that Turgenev and his noble fathers and sons? And this new generation can also create some activity. There are two trends. One of them is very good, that we can also help through the social media to distribute the knowledge. And the second one is also quite interesting one. It is quite normal thing. If we have a new information technology, it can also create a new nihilist like Chatsky or Bazarov. Mr. Skelezub I'm looking at him differently. You were remembering the good times where knowledge were transferred actually mutually from one person to another one, and the niggling they came actually to confuse our minds. We need to understand it. I think in the social media we need to give some importance to it. I would like to give a small comment to it. I think the biggest danger of the network is Molchalin. Is playing a role of Trotsky, but it's a kind of fake. We need to probably eliminate this small challenge in the networks. It's a very good literature amendment to our discussion. We already said we've got a very creative roundtable because we are discussing a very wide range of problems. But going back to the topic of natural or non-artificial monopolies, using our personal data, and this is a significant amount of data, I would like to start a discussion with the international experience. Martin, you're welcome.
Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, this is kind of I guess what I want to say broaches what Yanis talked about and moves us into discussion about competition. So I think there's something kind of within the very DNA of these network technologies that is the rationale for consumer protection, motivation laws. That is also the rationale for having privacy protection, and that quite possibly would require some sort of, anti-competitive breakup approach also. And I guess I see two paradoxes inherent in the DNA of these platforms. There's a kind of paradox with the value these are network technologies in the sense that they are more useful for a user. In contrast to, say, a Ferrari, they're more valuable, more useful the more other people have and engage with us on them. So telephones are the same. A telephone is absolutely useless to me if nobody else in the world has a telephone. But the paradox comes from the fact that as more and more people use that, some of the points I guess Alexei said, our exit options become increasingly less. And as consumers, we want to. Our power is, with our wallets and our ability to leave. And as users, that's important that we can leave. And the real danger is that we reach a sort of critical mass where we can't leave. The other point is, so I think that's a rationale certainly for consumer protection, from a kind of privacy protection perspective, leading on also to competition. There's a paradox between the more information that we're giving out, the more personal information that we're giving out, that information actually helps the services that we use to run better. They run better for us. That was the rationale for Google's recent change of its privacy laws, to have one homogeneous privacy law across all of the Google companies. So, you now deal with YouTube as you do with Google, Gmail. So one of the rationales there was that the more information you gave, the better it ran, and that makes sense. But I guess the danger is that we also become more vulnerable as we give that information. So really, the whole concept of privacy is being turned on its head by the fact that our privacy is not something that we necessarily shy away from. It's something that 10 years ago even, privacy was obviously something that was a core value we would want to protect. Now it's being reconstituted somewhat by these two paradoxes that are at the heart of social networks. And I think they're both, very valid rationales for moving away from that sort of monopolistic status.
Дмитрию хотел бы тоже.
I would like to give the floor to Dmitry. I would like to draw to the discussion of the monopoly of social networks, because it's quite close to the principle acting for the cell operators in Russia. We started discussing the information for the so-called take-away numbers, because in Russia there is no law that the operators are obliged to provide the numbers to other cell operators if the subscriber moves to another operator. Well, I think we are quite late with this story, and the subscribers do not see any value in keeping their phone numbers in other networks. What can we do here? We can keep this principle of keeping the number as an identification of a user, not only in the cell networks. It could be not only a telephone number, it can also be a kind of a number in the Skype network, and we can also use this telephone number for any other data stored by the user in any other social network or platform. It could be a list of contacts, a list of images or any other media files stored by the user in any social network. Why? We are not asking the question that the user can copy all his data from Facebook to vk.com or vice versa without losing this information, because he managed to collect within the last 5 years a certain profile with the data, and user should be entitled to copy this data or transfer this data to any other platform. And I'm talking about the services that can also substitute for the SMS and telephony. And Skype is blaming the traditional operators that they don't give the opportunity to Skype to develop. Certainly Skype can do it, but we can go on with this technological way. We can offer the Skype subscribers to move to the traditional networks when the traditional operators can offer the same kind of services, and it is important in the European Union to regulate this issue, because Article 18 of the draft directive, that is actually to substitute for the Directive 95 of the, and this Article 18 is about the personal data transfer, and Russia should also think about the developing such directives in this country in order to protect the competition. When Facebook was only developing and had a very small number of users, it was important to protect data. But now I agree with Alexei and Alexandra that now Facebook, for any social media, including Facebook, to provide better services, it is quite important to eliminate the following danger. Because there is a fear that a certain user can leave a certain social media service and go and move to another service provider. So it is quite important for the social media to become more better. And I will give the floor to Mikhail now for his comment. I've got 3 short comments. As for the monopoly of privacy and personal data for the identification, it is quite important to understand here that a lot of Russian officials have the following attitude to the Russian people as the users of the state services. You as citizens have to pay taxes, to vote once in 4 years, and don't ask any unneeded questions. If we had these 3 simple rules for the network users, it would be great, and probably but all the social media would go bust in this case, and because there wouldn't be any business here. And I'm a lawyer. I would like to tell you that we are people, and actually thanks to the social networks, we are able to assess how important the creativity of people is, and I think it is a very prospective topic, and that's why the social media are so successful. The second thing, we talked about the problems existing in the area of regulation. I would like to tell you what probably some of you may not like. We have also examples in Russia, and I hope that our authorities can learn something of it in how to survive in a high competition. This is actually the cell operator, though, who is here because we have a lot of issues in which are using our criticism to the state. This criticism is well regulated by the contracts among the cell operators in Russia. And the business, the cell business that developed in Russia shows that everything is going right here, and we can also take the real practice of the cell operators in Russia, how these relationships are regulated for the millions of Russian cell users, because it was a high competition. It was regulated, but not so strong as any other communication means. I don't really want to tell you how the relationships between the cell operators and the landlines were regulated. Was very awful, but the results are good. However, our three big cell operators in Russia are looking quite good in comparison to the cell operators from abroad. And I don't really trust to the success of any internet project without infrastructure. First of all, it was quite strange for me when we have a co-moderator from Megaphone here. I think it's quite logical, because in 5 years we will have some devices that will also mobile devices providing access to any social media, and it will be probably the main device for collecting money for the social network. So only those who used to be cell operators will survive. And we need to learn from each other and learn how to live together, because the access to internet and internet services will be done only through the cell operators. I mean, MTS, Megaphone, and Beeline in Russia, and these companies will be multi-profile telecommunication operators, and I hope that the profits from the voice traffic will be much less than now. And I think it's kind of convergence that we will face in the future. Thank you very much. As a cell operator, we are also interested in developing the market.
Related to the use of personal data, because in the first part of the discussion we saw that a mobile cell phone is like a toothbrush. It's a very personal device, and that is a device that collects a huge amount of information, and no other device collects as much information as a cell phone. Nor the state, nor how we pay the taxes, because it's a geopositioning device, and it's also a device to choose our preferences, and it's also a communication device. So naturally, this issue is of great importance for us, and we'll be talking about that. But right now, I would like to focus on how competition can help us develop innovations. And I'm here rather not a representative of a mobile operator, but as a fan of technologies and Soviet social networks and the internet, because for me as a person it's important for the internet to develop, to improve its services, and so that the penetration of these services is better. We've visited, my colleagues and mine and me visited the anti-monopoly service, and there we discussed a very important issue which also has a link to today's discussion, and this is a possibility of regulating IP in an anti-monopoly sphere. We think that the volumes of personal data that has been accumulated in social networks and in other aggregated information are very much like an intellectual product of a sort that those social networks possess, because they process that information, they make conclusions, and depending on those conclusions, deriving from that amount of knowledge and data, it can be managed. Facebook, and that's no secret, provides any user with a selection of any other users depending on the age residence and priorities. So this is the targeted advertisement. And the question of monopolization, of monopoly in this sphere is also of major importance. Why Instagram was bought at $1 billion, although it has 20 employees? Because it's a promising technology. And when major companies such as Facebook merge or acquire small companies who really have breakthrough technologies, that may have a negative impact, that may impede the development of innovation. And I believe that any government, whether Russian, American, or European, must have the right to interfere into such relations in order not to allow impeding the progress. I can say the same about the cell phone operators' business. This is a very good example. It's not very convenient for us when Skype is developing in our networks, and for a time we had a discussion among major operators about a way to prohibit Skype or regulating Skype in such a way that it shares money with us, that it pays us. And whether willing or nilling, at the level of basic services, the services that have become a pipeline, we are trying to stop progress. And I would like to listen to my colleagues with European and American experience about the correct balance between the development of major players, serious high-quality players, and innovation and the support of development.
Thanks for your comment. Anna, first of all, I want to commend you for your honesty about the situation of the mobile companies in some ways. The things you've said over the last half an hour would never be said by an American carrier, ever. They would never. I'm just telling you right now, it's a level of honesty, which is they are always saying we don't have any real important information. I mean, it's everything you say is clear. I think the mobile does have more information than anyone else, including the government, and also I think it's clear that you have an interest in trying to block a company like Skype, although it sounds like you didn't. I spent a lot of time in the U.S. government thinking about this problem of emerging technological internet leader companies and the antitrust laws, the competition laws, and it's not an easy question, obviously, and I want to suggest a few things that are very interesting about the market. Some special challenges. First of all, one thing that's really unusual, and you mentioned this earlier, is how, at least in the United States and in many countries in Europe, how many of the markets are dominated by one company, how many of them go to monopoly? Even in, you're talking about cell phones, I think you have at least three companies in cell phones. If you think about beers, you know, there's probably a dozen different beers, and you know, some people like this beer, some people like that beer, blah, 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 some people more Irish beer, more. But when it comes to search engines, at least in America and most of Europe, people like Google. When it comes to social networks, everybody likes Facebook. Now, I know there's countries where it's different, and Russia is a good example of where it's different. But in most countries, these markets are all converging towards monopoly. And that raises some very interesting questions, classic questions. The question is, well, what do you do about a company that is a monopolist but is not necessarily evil or hasn't done anything that seems particularly bad? I think Google is a great example of that. They are, in the United States and most of Europe, clearly a monopoly, but they didn't, as far as we know, they don't have a track record of evil deeds or putting other people out of business. They just beat them because they were better. Facebook, more or less the same story. I don't think we have a strong pattern of anti-competitive conduct. We just have people like Facebook. And so there these companies are. And it's a very classic problem that it was actually faced about 100 years ago with telephone networks, a very similar story. And there are three kind of answers that countries have traditionally taken. Number one is a pure laissez-faire, just okay, you know, they're a good company, let them do whatever. Another alternative, very popular in the Soviet Union and actually a lot of Europe, is to nationalize the firms. So if we were talking 100 years ago, people would say, well, Google's a monopoly, therefore the answer is they should be owned by the government. This is very important. This was a popular answer about 100 years ago. I don't think it's the answer now, but it's the answer. And then the third answer was a regulated monopoly, which is to say you accept it's a monopoly and in fact protect it and impose regulations, usually price regulations and discrimination. So I personally think none of those are a good approach. But those are, I want to say those are historical approaches. I personally think they're not, none of them is that good. Nationalization, I mean, it leads to state-run companies which don't have a very good track record. Regulated monopoly is almost the same thing. And laissez-faire, then the company becomes, after a while, abusive and dangerous. So what I think is that my approach to this problem, and if you're interested in this, I wrote a book on, basically a book on this topic, called The Master Switch, is that the government, I don't think should be intervening so strongly, but they should be watching and making sure that if something better does come along, that it will beat the old company. So you need to watch Facebook, watch Google, all these companies very carefully, and if someone better is coming, to take away their ability to destroy their competitors. And I think that's the best approach. And it's not easy, and it's hard to know when they're taking steps to destroy their competitors, but I think that's what I would see the best role of antitrust law in this area.
Можно я к Николаю Карташову?
I will address Nikolai Kartashov with the same question because he represents our antitrust agency. What do you think about such natural monopolies among social networks, whether Russian or foreign, and how should you react to that in your opinion? Well, certainly, I could partially agree with Timothy, in particular with his first principle, that is that observe and laissez-faire. One of the principles that I talked about, actually, and I believe that the regulator must not interfere in the market when the market is free, when the market is self-sufficient. We must not impose our own rules of business, our own rules of the game. The market will must decide what is necessary for the market, but there are some particular instances, like with Google. Well, this is my personal opinion again. There is some ambiguity here. Timothy said that Google was the best, that's why it won. I believe this is a doubtful statement. In my opinion, in my personal opinion, well, look at the situation in the world. The situation with search engines. Apart from Google, there's several search engines that remain in business. Yandex, the Chinese search engines, and I don't know who else. And that's it. All other English language search engines which actually consumed all other territories that talk other languages. Whether it's better, the best or not, is a good question. Certainly the market must define what commodity is better, what service is better, and promote that best service. But there is also national interests here. It's no secret that a search engine is one of the ways to impact the consumer, and so it can regulate our desires and direct our desires just because the program is written, the software is written by people. And in my opinion, we shouldn't forget about that. That is, apart from the market issues, we shouldn't forget about the interests of the country where you live. And that is an important thing, especially about the net, because the net's biggest advantage is its openness, its accessibility. We value that, but there's a reverse side to that coin. Well, that is briefly my opinion. Thank you very much. Nick, I have a question. We understand very well that you cannot kill freedom by regulation. This is a wrong approach. Everyone agrees with that. Another question is, what is the impact of the anti-monopoly service? Can you see the Russian antitrust service as a tool for subtle tuning of relationships within a system that we cannot now regulate by using clear-cut rules? It's quite clear that if we pass a law where it is written that the net is no longer anonymous, that will be a different situation. But on the other hand, we cannot come to another scenario. We cannot keep the current scenario because absolute freedom leads to absolute loss of freedom through monopolization and other barriers. So what is your opinion and the opinion of your service? The situation with regulating new economies, new relationships, unusual relationships based on the aggregation of personal data, on monopolization, on using such market domination tools that were previously absent in the economy. So is your service ready? Well, we have your boss in the next room. Are you ready for that? Well, of course we are. That's why we're here. I'm sitting in this room and my boss is in the room next door. That's why we're sitting and listening to the opinion of the businesses and to the opinion of foreign experts who came to share their knowledge in this sphere. But the key thing is that we must be very careful when doing that. And in my opinion, you were right about very fine tuning, because for fine tuning you need a problem. Maybe it's a small scale tuning, a small problem, but we cannot just adjust something in our own manner. We cannot turn the knobs as we want it to turn them. You must tell us, well, this nut is loose, if you allow me this comparison. Then we will intervene. And you must understand clearly that, well, you know, it's a sphere where interests of many players collide. It's a sphere of interest by consumers, by the government, by the businesses, both big businesses and SMEs, and the big three and Skype, as you mentioned, and all of the opinions, and most importantly, that we do not infringe on any player, on any stakeholder, because we may turn into something that really kills someone's desires to promote business in this country. So we must not do that, and fine-tuning is possible, of course. We are ready to do that. If you remember, we discussed one of the issues, and the colleagues were present there, and the issue was how do we see a collision between IP rights and the monopoly allowed by law. So this collision of interest. And there's an adjoining sphere that is a social network, and how the protection of competition affects that, because in the examples by Timothy and by another speaker, we see that certainly you can regulate this sphere, but you must be very, very careful about it. Thank you very much for this optimistic comment. I would like to pass the floor to Yanis Leonis.
Yes, I have actually 4 points to make, and I'll try to be quite brief. I think the first issue we haven't necessarily resolved, because everyone mentioned the word natural monopoly here. And I mean, the question is, do we really have a natural social monopoly? I mean, is really Facebook the only game in town, or are there any other substitutes than Facebook? And I would think this is a very important question. And I would say I can see, you know, a number of other companies around in this particular area. You have Google+, obviously, Twitter, LinkedIn, MySpace, but also a wealth of other specialized websites that may, you know, may revolve around age, language, you know, and so this is something that we have to take into account. Then when you think about monopoly, you think about market. You have to define a market in order to find that there's a monopoly in that market. And then what is a market here? Is it like viewers? I mean, this is how you're going to see, you know, that Facebook, for example, has a monopoly because it has 10 times more viewers than Twitter or something else. Is it going to be the advertised type of the advertisement issue? I mean, the revenue comes from advertising. But in this case, is it going to be online as well as offline advertising? I mean, is online advertising a particular market, or should you actually include offline advertising too? In which case, we don't really have a natural monopoly here. Or is it going to be just, you know, kind of a more prospective analysis of like the market for monetization of personal information, like something really like, you know, forward-looking, in which case maybe you'll say that, well, in this case, Facebook might be a natural monopoly because it has unique information. But in this case, as you mentioned, the mobile telephony might be a substitute, and therefore if you include in the same market as well the mobile operators as well as Facebook, then somehow you have, you know, you don't really have a natural monopoly. So that's the first question. The second issue is, assuming that you have defined a market and there is some form of dominance there, the second issue is competition a click away? I mean, what are the barriers to entry or to exit for the consumer's point of view from this particular monopoly? I mean, are they locked in or not, giving the monopoly the possibility to exploit them somehow? And there is that's an issue which I think, you know, is also something which is an empirical issue which has to be resolved. And at the same time, obviously, you might think of ways for authorities to come in and somehow regulate that particular issue. For example, this portability of data, which can somehow break down this barrier. But what is interesting there is that, and I think this is and I'm not really like playing it oh my God, Europe is amazing, but I think that the European framework actually offers quite interesting, probably superior than the US model, because the data portability is something that is available, as Dimitri mentioned before, through the privacy regulation. So it's not actually an antitrust remedy as such. Actually, it's actually done through the privacy regulation framework, which somehow, because the main problem with data portability as a competition remedy is that it might, you know, run into privacy problems. I mean, if you say that, okay, data portability, and this is a remedy that I'm going to impose in order to break down the barriers to entry, that actually somehow might infringe privacy, as Alexei mentioned before. But the idea of giving that possibility to the privacy, the data privacy regulators to do, somehow preserves and makes it the balance between competition and privacy be done basically in a way which is favorable to privacy. And somehow, you know, it is a quite interesting mechanism, which I think you don't have in the US, because the FTC doesn't really have, as far as I know. But maybe Tim will, you know, it's not like a privacy regulator. Now, that's the second point. The third point is that, okay, assuming that you found that there's a monopoly, there's a market, and there are barriers to entry, then, you know, you have, in order to apply antitrust, you have to identify some bad conduct. I mean, you cannot just come there and say, well, this is bad. I mean, you have to, these companies should have done something bad in order to prosecute them. And in this particular case, you know, you might say that at least there is some case law, or at the beginning of some case in the United States, because there have been some private actions, but also in the European Union there have been some, obviously, investigations by the European Commission of Google Plus and Google. I mean, the possibility that Google can use actually the results of Google Plus. There are two issues there. The first issue I would say is that these different companies, they might somehow enter into exclusionary contracts in order, let's say, to exclude game developers, basically, certain game developers or certain applications from their platform. Now, the question there is, what is the interest of Facebook doing that? And actually, one could even say that Facebook doesn't even, I mean, as far as I know, is not basically itself an application developer. So, I mean, the classic antitrust story is the leveraging story in the sense that you have a monopoly in one market and you try actually to extend it in another one where you're present. But here, actually, the big part of the monopoly story, the leveraging story, is missing because, you know, the Facebook, for example, is not present in the, you know, downstream market. Google, it is maybe, huh? So that could be an issue. And there have been, like, issues concerning the syndication contracts that Google has done with a number of applications. Now, the second issue is something which concerns the exploitation issue. And that might be the discrimination issue, the price discrimination issue, the quality discrimination issue. You know, discrimination can be either in price, either on quality. And there, the European actually framework is, I would say, also more complete than the US one, because price discrimination and generally discrimination by a dominant firm may constitute an abuse which can infringe Article 102 of the treaty. And not only that, but even excessive pricing might also be considered as an abuse as well. And I'm putting back that again. And, you know, I could see, I mean, and I've looked at some data about the difference of pricing for certain advertising between Google and Yahoo. And one could probably say, I don't know, I mean, it's a question. I mean, how is the difference might be explained? Is it the fact that Google has more data to offer and therefore, you know, you're paying for more things? Or is it like product of the dominant position they have? I mean, it's somehow a question there. I mean, obviously you have to be very careful, and it's just very, very careful in enforcing excessive pricing type of cases because there is a high risk of error. And in this particular case, if you do a mistake, it might somehow ruin innovation in the industry. But I mean, this is an issue that is there. And the thirdly is a third issue of conduct, basically, is the fact that you might, you know, have a classic leveraging story and then somehow give preference to your own vertically integrated companies, like what Google is basically accused of at the European level of somehow giving preference to its own services in their search results, organic results. So somehow this is some form of leveraging. Now, once you have identified all these issues and you say, okay, there is a monopoly, there's barrier to entry, and 3, there's an abuse or some kind of bad conduct, the fourth issue is what is going to be the instrument you're going to use in order to deal with this issue, okay? And I could say that you may say, well, I might really get it wrong. I don't know anything about this industry. I might not necessarily know anything, even if I have a lot of investigations. I mean, I don't really have the specialists. It's a very complicated area. It's an area which moves very quickly anyway. So, and I'm taking a Schumpeterian view of things. You know, the market will come. You know, the big companies are probably better. You know, they produce more innovation than smaller companies because they have more profitability and they invest in R&D. So let's basically, you know, the market continue. Let's don't. You know, there's a fair policy, which Schumpeterian type of somehow explain. The second will be, I would say, the antitrust tool, okay, which is to intervene, okay, but to intervene ad hoc in case, you know, there is a problem, in case there is, let's say, through private enforcement, through public enforcement, in case there is a complaint, and investigate case by case, you know, the facts of the case and find a remedy on this issue. Which could be tailored remedy, or even actually use antitrust in order to make the companies somehow be more careful and you know, think that they are watched, and therefore, you know, just play a little bit more gentleman type of competition rather than a bully or cowboy competition. And the third option is actually to to develop a regulator in this particular case. And there have been even suggestions in the United States. I've read an article a couple of years ago, maybe like not a couple of years ago, quite recently, about some people were suggesting the creation of the search engine authority or something like that, a regulator that will somehow intervene in this particular sector, which will preserve, this, the portability aspects of data and then make sure it works. But in this case, obviously, you have to figure out what are the costs of having this specific type of regulation, and obviously what are the benefits you're going to get and what are the type of problems you're going to try to use. So, I mean, these are my comments concerning the competition policy aspects of these issues.
Да, Тим, пожалуйста.
Oh, go ahead, since he addressed some issues. We're now squarely clearly talking about competition law, and so Jan, he's gotten very excited, and I've gotten excited because this is our field. We are the geeks of antitrust competition law, and I appreciate your comments. I thought they were very thoughtful, and I think the first principle for antitrust or competition regulation should be like a doctor, to do no harm. I mean, you don't want to make things worse. And I was just going to add, this is really, you touched on this, but I want to reiterate, what I forgot to mention, I think the challenge in these tech markets, in addition to the issues of market definition and everything you were talking about, is the question of a good remedy. Assuming you find a problem, assuming you don't like, you think Facebook's being, and there's some leveraging concerns maybe with Facebook and Google or something, but even if you think they're preserving their monopoly, the question of what is the remedy is a really hard question, because you don't want to make the product worse, right? And so many of the remedies sort of make sense from a theoretical, the Trotskyist perspective. Someone said Trotsky earlier, but they make the product worse for the consumer. And it's supposed to be, a law is supposed to be about humans, and if you have some strange data portability scheme that is in theory supposed to encourage competition, but in practice just makes people's lives difficult, that's not good. I mean, you can have good versions of them, but I think that's the challenge, and you really need some talent to come up with good remedies. Europe has not been good at this. I don't think we've been that good either in the United States, sometimes. Generally, I think, well, we can have another conversation about remedy, but that is the big challenge. How do you do something that does not actually make the product worse? By the way, we've taken enough photos by now. Can we, cancel the photography? Is that all right? Enough photos, I think. I think we've, 40 photos of each person might be good enough, right? You guys are in charge of the panel, right? So you can cancel you're the moderator, right? He's giving me a look, he doesn't like it, but. I'm a photographer too. At some point, it's too much. It's distracting. All right, you have someone else.
Хорошо.
Yeah, good. I would like also to be quite short. Now we listen to certain dialogue where we got a new area, and now we have started talking about the justice, and now we're calling about the remuneration, because remuneration deals with the topic 3 of our round table, because all the questions we discussed here it is certainly assessed, can something be free of charge and should be chargeable, and how it is actually profitable for the infrastructure operators. This week we had also a meeting of the Ministry of Communication in Moscow, and we were discussing how not to violate the intellectual property rights. So we have to teach people how to pay for these intellectual services and products, because people should understand that there is nothing for free, because a lot of things provided with social media is free of charge as an attraction for people, and the social media earn money in a different way. And we'd like to draw attention. We can create a site, the social media, and sell network that can substitute for social internet media. We had a lot of discussion about the events of London last August. There were some protests on the street that were provoked and coordinated by those who send the information to each other, message to each other via BlackBerry phones. It was not a pure internet, it was not a pure cell communication. This SMS or messages were free of charge, sent by BlackBerry owners, and it was quite difficult to identify the portability criteria in how we talk about the identity here, because the net neutrality is something what is quite important, or what should be prioritized if we want to transfer information from one platform to another one, and have a very bad feeling that this is not a subject of discussion in our country, and it's quite difficult also to find a consensus even internationally. Thank you very much. We recommend the topic 3 is net neutrality. Well, let's finalize topic 2 and then we'll come over to the topic 3. One small comment to the governmental regulation of big companies' activity. I would like to share you the experience from Israel, because the Israeli government made a decision to influence in an indirect way. The government provided a lot of money to create small companies, small internet-oriented companies working through, it's like ICQ on Sundays companies. Some of them are well known now. And the Israeli government decided to provide money to incubators. They were kind of alternative. They were doing the projects when the government was interested in, and not the big vendors like Microsoft. And the big number of new, small, dynamically developing companies create a new reality in Israel. The country that didn't have anything 10 years ago became a new new Silicon Valley. It was kind of wonder. A lot of people spoke Russian there, and it was quite a big thing when a lot of qualified professionals came from Russian CIS countries to Israel to do this job. I think it was a good example of indirect influence. I also apologize for it. I would like to add 2 more things. And you said the technical part. There was also a question about being in vk.com or Facebook. There are new technologies, and we like them. It's the mashup technology. We get 2 or 3 new mashups in California every week, and there's a technology that integrates the Web 2.0 services, and those mashups are used. It's software in such a source like YouTube, so your personal identity is becomes a mesh-up oriented. And you were absolutely right when you said that the mobile devices are personal equipment identifying your identity. But it's only the only start of this story, because the cell phones is just the first animal. It's actually the predecessor of the dinosaurs, because internet is a dinosaur. Because the RFID device will be embedded in all the things available in our life. It can be clothing, shoes. So this device will be connected even better than the cell phones are connected now. And now it's your word, Mr. Smith and Wesson, to regulate the situation. And this is actually futurological. Our description is quite close to us, because we think that we can come over to the net neutrality and think what can dominate in the future and will identify our life as users, because it is clear that all our things will be chipped and they will be connected, and this communication will be provided by technological networks, and the technological networks cost something at the moment, because we started talking about money, and I think the net neutrality topic is well connected, and we're expecting the presentation from Ruslan Ibrahimov. We're going to start this net neutrality discussion from his presentation. I would like to tell you that we understand, and the global trend proves it, that the traditional voice is losing its importance, not because the people stop talking on the phone. It is going to be just an additional service to other services from another environment. So the main services are moving to internet. It could be Skype, ICQ services, and so on, or a machine to machine, when a SIM card can be embedded into a fridge, and the fridge can also order some milk from internet shop if there is no milk in fridge. I think it sounds very dangerous when you are not able to control your common things you used to have in your life, and they start to live their own life. Or for example, your iron can get switched off as soon as no shirts are needed to be ironed. But it is normally based on our basic networks by internet. As if you're talking about the business, the question of money is still acute, because we need to develop the networks and money for it. I would like to give an example, because MTS and Megaphone made together announced that because the data traffic rate doubled within the last year, and this growth is quite significant, because the content becomes more complicated. We start watching movies in a better quality through YouTube. We download torrents, what is actually not allowed to do, because it's a breach of copyright, but everybody does it. But someone should also invest money into the development of networks. It could be the government or big operators, or as Tim said, that Facebook earned enough money on our personal data. Probably we need to let Facebook build something tangible.
Of course, I'm being a little bit provocative. It's my pleasure to pass the floor to Ruslan Ibrahimov. Thank you. Well, I will start with some high-level things. Maybe not everyone here is an IT expert. The very term net neutrality, who is it aimed at, and how does that term correspond to the principle of equal access to the net? This is something that is fixed in our law. There's a government resolution whose essence is that we as internet providers must provide equal access to all the users to the network. And this is a basic principle that we try to abide by. And up to recent times, that was easy enough, but the situation started changing significantly as soon as there came up operators, the OTT, over-the-top operators, who started rendering similar services, sometimes the same as the communications operators, over the communication operators' networks to the users of those networks. And they started to cannibalize part of the revenues that the operators earned from their users. I don't mean new services. That is not a problem. The same kind of services in the same networks. And a problem arises. A problem is quite serious. It's a legal problem and it's a financial problem. The pioneer in our market was Skype and other companies that rendered similar services following that model. And I remember that meeting at the Federal Antitrust Service when their representatives came and explained to us and to the federal agency that they have all the rights to render their services. And that was digital information that turned into a voice message. It was transmission of videos and so on and so forth. And the position of the Federal Antitrust Service was as follows, approximately. Yes, services like Skype. We're not talking about specific companies. Yes, these services have the right to exist. They must not be blocked. They cannot be regulated, because they are beneficial to the people, because they provide the same services for less money. I allowed myself to compare Skype operators with a railroad conductor who lets people in without tickets, and it's cheaper for the passengers, and he uses someone else's railroad cars. And I say that these conductors are also very nice, but these nice things are well described in the criminal code. And then the problem aggravated. There's more and more OTT operators emerging, and the problem of Skype is actually receding. There's new services like Viber and other services, quite a lot of them, and the quantitative problem is turning into a qualitative problem. I will myself to ask our technician, our radio engineer, to open the third page of my presentation so that everything is clear. The third page, please. The third is the one that comes after the second. This is the first one. Well, are you failing? Shall I wait for you or shall I continue? This is statistics. I just wanted to demonstrate it, to visualize my point. Okay. We took the Cisco data and we looked at the growth of those numbers of those OTT operators, and we looked at the traffic that will pass over our networks in the nearest future. Between 2011 and 2016, in those 5 years, the growth of traffic in mobile networks, the overall growth of traffic, or the overall traffic, will grow depending on the number of services manifold. For instance, it will grow 18-fold by 2016. The transmission of video will grow 16 times, and the share of videos will constitute 70% of all the traffic. I understand that it's difficult to perceive those numbers orally. That's why I wanted to show them. 10.8 exabyte per month. That's 10 to the power of 18 bytes. So you see the numbers. I should have provided translation, probably. Nevertheless, you see the growth 18 times and 25 times for the video in 5 years. This is the forecast. Next one, please. This slide demonstrates the real picture. We are a company that invests in a lot of money into the development of our network. just to compare the numbers. And this is approximately 20% of our annual revenue, which we invest in extending networks, extending their capacity to provide for the growing need for traffic. And what we have now, 20%. By the way, in Europe, I may be wrong, but in our estimates, operators usually spend 15% of annual revenue to extend their networks. So this is the status, and it will only allow us to increase the capacity 5 times in those 5 years. So we see an avalanche-like growth of traffic and a small increase in the network capacities. The question is whether the networks would tolerate such traffic, would bear such traffic. Secondly, do we provide the equality of users? Do we provide equal access to the internet? Cisco says that 1% of users generates 50% of traffic. Just think about that. So 52% of the traffic is generated by 1% of users, and 99% of the users, when the traffic is heavier, what happens to access? The rate of access, the speed goes down. So in this situation, do we keep equal opportunities? From our point, no. In other words, this situation, in general, from our standpoint, may result in network discrimination for the majority of users. Thanks to 1%, and thanks to the heavy traffic that they will transmit over the networks. So the balance of rights. So there are some different kinds of users, and certainly monetization. The source of extending networks in Russia was the money collected from users. Nowadays, when there's a lot of operators who, without their own networks, use others' networks, use existing networks, and using the customers of others' operators, and the operators have invested in promotion, in advertisement, in dealers, so every customer costs some money for the operator, and so these new operators get access to those customers, and they actually get a lot of money on that. So you can send an SMS bypassing the operator, and the operator would never know about that and would never know that he's losing money. So the forecast is probably that the operators will have smaller revenues, but the necessity to invest into the network is increasing. So the revenues goes down, the costs go up, and the situation is like when a ship is sinking and there's one lifeboat and everyone wants to get on that boat, and as a result they sink that boat. Will we come to a situation like this? And certainly we are very much concerned about this situation. First, we see that there's discrimination against the vast majority of the customers. We see that we might fail to expand the capacity, and that means the speed goes down and there's no quality. And as a result, it means that we are working for someone else's benefit. We do not think this is quite just. Well, must we find a solution to this? Yes, probably we must. Well, I'm not ready to provide any recipes, but the overall problem is that the new operators are, by using somebody else's assets by using the client bases must also provide take care of the networks. Must they incur costs? I think it is just. How do we do that? The law does not provide an answer because actually they must come to an agreement with the operators, either share the revenues from the services that they render to the customers, or somehow to invest into the network development to provide them a possibility of high-speed access. And that's a problem. Thank you. Well, maybe the state should interfere. That's a question to the government. There's a way of making the state do this, but since this is not a very popular measure, the government also behaves very cautiously, while the problem is aggravating. Thank you, Ruslan. I suggest that Mikhail should be given an opportunity to speak, because he might provide a content-wise look at this problem. I have a very brief question. It's not a discussion. The colleagues from MTS, without prejudice to everything they said, my question is, why do you, as a successful mobile operator, fast-growing, decided to purchase the local infrastructure of internet access and to compete with the people whom you criticize? Because the analogy is that suppose a major railroad company, or automotive company buys. Well, I think that's a very personal question. I would not go into that. The problem is clear. And let us listen to Mikhail Braude, because he will be speaking about the technical. Well, it was very difficult for me not to interfere. I don't want to come to bad terms with operators of mobile communication, because there's only 3 of those in this country. I will be. You know, it's by way of introduction. I heard a monopolist here. I heard a firm that acquired certain position in the market and believes that their position in the market must be somehow provided for. And I think that's a copyright ideology. It is in the copyright. We have a monopoly to provide a stimulus for some development. I don't think this is the right idea, although it dominates in modern world. I think it's a coinage of ideas. We are the best. We have won the position in the market, and let us make the society think about how to save our revenues, because if you don't save our revenues, our costs will exceed our profits. I do not understand this at the basic level. Why are we discussing this at all? Why do we presume that the 3, with all due respect to those operators, they look quite decent price-wise and reliability-wise? I don't want to criticize them, but why do we think that they are irreplaceable? There will be other people coming, there will be new technologies, there will be new ways of solving these problems, and we don't want to protect them in any way. In principle, I think this is a wrong methodology. You cannot presume the world will be the same tomorrow as it is today. We don't have to think about it. I'll tell you how the world will solve this problem. Price. If your traffic grows 20 times and the capacity only 5 times, there will be another price. This is the first thing that will happen, even in our strongly regulated market. And what would happen in a free market? There would be the 5th, the 4th, 27th operator of the infrastructure that would build the infrastructure cheaper than the current quasi-monopolist because they have a stimulus. They have, well, of course, they have to protect themselves from the state. They will have other incentives to reduce the costs. Well, capitalization is certainly beneficial for the shareholders, but the society does not want to increase the capitalization of one player. Let us have 33 players in the market rather than 3, and the market will be smaller and cheaper. Yes, other people, lots of people will have to change their jobs because they will no longer be needed for some reason. It won't happen tomorrow. Maybe that happened 5 years and 10 years, but that will happen. Well, yeah, you understand me. I can talk for a long time about this. Can we forget about personal questions, because this is not the problem, and let us ask Mikhail or other people who know about technology how to respond to the demand by the consumer to increase the traffic exponentially all the time, and how to increase the capacity of the networks technologically. Probably there is a technological answer to that. Well, because there may be compression, traffic compression. The current operators cannibalize the efforts by good engineers who developed good technologies and use their inventions without taking care of those engineers. This is just that happened. They just cannibalized their efforts, and we still believe that is a good thing. There is a progress, and people wanted to publish their achievements, inventions, and we use that. Well, we shouldn't do that. Once again, the society and the market players will do that themselves with a minimum of regulation. So you can have a demand more than 5 times more than supply, and without a change of price. Yes, it's very pleasant to have a small subscribers fee, and it is much more convenient. The market will be same, but if we find that 1% uses half of the traffic, this the answer is clear. So you have to pay for the traffic.
You can also give other prices. You can also price against the traffic consumed. It will be also good for you as an operator, so there will be a justice. So you are entitled to price your service as you think it is actually good. We are not talking about the net neutrality. I'm talking about the traffic pricing. You can also just have a flat rate, or you can also price your traffic, and you are not limited in it, and we don't do it to a certain extent. There are different answers for it, and Tim Wu is here, wrote a book, and he will tell us that we are facing a change in this industry, and very soon, especially in the communication industry, and that the income of the landlines are not going forward, not growing, but the cell operators still have better profits. Do we need to reply on these comments? If these comments are personal, you shouldn't prepare. If you want to discuss the rate policy of a cell operator, it's a personal question. Let's listen to Timothy Wu, and then during the breaks we can discuss any questions. Unfortunately, our round table is limited by time, and in 30 minutes we have to finish this round table. I'd like to give the opportunity floor to other people in our panel.
Feels as initially the kind of strong feelings people had about Bolshevism or communism 100 years ago. You know, you want to get people excited about something. Net neutrality is a big topic. My own contribution to the debate is that I invented the word net neutrality, actually, originally. So it's my own well, I don't know if invented it, but I published the first idea of the word. So I've watched it change a lot. And I think the debate is at a quite advanced level here, and you're basically getting into the issue, which is, it's very unusual. I saw this graph where I see the demand going up. And most companies, when the demand goes up, they actually like that. Most companies are very excited when, if you're an oil company or something, and the new cars are using more oil and more gas, everybody says this is terrific. We're going to make more money. And the telecom industry is an unusual position because it complains about demand. And I don't understand, I've never quite understood this, but I think it's because of pricing. To take the telecom, the consumers have usually wanted a flat rate for everything. And it's a difficult transition, I think, is the issue, to get people used to a different kind of pricing. But at some fundamental level, if 1% of the people want to use a huge amount of product, it's like people who want to drive a huge truck or something, an SUV. They have enormous demand for the product, they should pay more. It seems simple. And I understand, I'm sympathetic to the fact that it's challenging to change pricing models, but what they're describing is really a pricing problem. And my concern with leaving behind net neutrality principles is, even though it's often said for a good purpose, the real interest is being able to, in some sense, have some power over what applications succeed and which ones fail. And even if they mean well, we've had that system before when you had telecom monopolies who would decide what businesses could succeed or fail, and they did a terrible job. It was another form of central planning. In America, when AT&T decided what was going to go forward and what wasn't, they made terrible decisions, and they never let anything happen, and you would not even have the internet if they were still in charge. So I think for the long-term health of the economy, it's important not to let the telephone companies become the central planners of the internet economy.
Спасибо большое. Я просто не могу пропустить эту тему, что...
Thank you very much for you, because I would like to stick to the topic that the price decides everything. There was a case in Russia when they had a subscriber in Vladimir, when the people went on vacation and they connected a modem and they wanted to download a soap opera, and they were doing it through a torrent, so the session were not disconnected, and so the traffic caused 1 million rubles, and the court said that they had to pay 1 million rubles. It's a lot of money. There's a question about how much oil a certain car can consume, and then the respondent said that I'm a pensioner and I get only 10,000 rubles a month, and I'm not able to give this 1 million ruble to you back. And the court took the position of a weak person, that the price was not in correspondence with the consumer expectation. We didn't give an opportunity to the user understand that he can also pay 1 million ruble for the cell services. In this user normally used to live in Russia and never used the torrent downloading in roaming, and we as the big cell operators should explain to the citizens that you shouldn't use such service, that your traffic can cost a lot of money and you won't be able to accompany. That's actually my response to the team's command. When the oil companies are happy when the consumption grows, and the telecommunication companies are not really happy about the increase of traffic. So we have a social responsibility. We're not can set prices we want. We had cases when the kids started using some online service, and then the parents for these services their 3-year budget. As for the consumption, we as in oil companies are also happy when the traffic grows, but with one condition: when we able to price the growing traffic. And what I'm talking now is similar to the man. Please transfer 1 ton of send to this angle, I will pay 100 rubles. And tomorrow, please transfer 2 tons of sand, and I will pay you 50 rubles. I think it's actually the self-killing business policy. However, the problem is not in the growing traffic. The problem is where the incomes are growing or not. And only this is a source for growing traffic. This is actually the direction we need to go to. I just wanted to respond to your remark, but I forgot. Also, we got a comment from the audience. So we have some people in the audience wanting to say something. You can hear me. I just got an idea listening to you. You've got my own opinion, which is a bit from a side. Not really from a side, but because the next claims will be from the social media we're discussing now. Why? It is because they have their own resources and there are some so-called over-the-top people earning on their resources and platforms from different game applications. At the moment they are not really visible, but I think that's the next phase of the development is because the social media could be a monopoly, but it's also a market for others. On one hand, it is a market player, for example, Wiki.com or Google, but these monopolies are also a market for other sorts, and it's a kind of pyramid. And I think it's quite interesting to discuss this situation. And my small comment is, because Ruslan is probably the only person who is trying to speak really loud, but I think there is no sense to do what you are discussing, because the next claims are actually quite near. I think it's a kind of pyramid in the circus, because the internet is the only one. I didn't want to give this example to you, but after this example, let's get familiar with the Novikov's example, and our regulator is well familiar. If you look at the mini buses, for example, if you want to just operate a bus line from point A to point B, you can start transfer passengers, and you can also identify the demand on this bus line. So we've got a service and demand, and then we can also find some others, free riders, who can come to this line, and they will come and compete, decrease the prices and be probably less efficient. The first one was quite efficient in planning and forecasting, and the free riders, they are more efficient in providing the transport services. Let's invest, because I invested. And if we don't protect the investment right now, if we don't really limit the number of bus lines on this route, this is actually the same conversation in a competitive economy. There will be players begging for protection, because we will have some free riders who can also smash me up and this is an exception the mankind made, and this is also
Мне кажется, прелесть нашей дискуссии заключается в том, что все примеры, которые мы приводим из физического мира, они не работают в высокотехнологичной сфере, потому что нигде потребление нефти, воды, маршрутного такси не растет экспонентно, то, о чем говорил Руслан. Поэтому все примеры из того, что если бы там отменить канализацию, да, они здесь не работают. Потому что...
Вы знаете, я с этим вообще не согласен.
знаете, они похожи, наоборот. Потребление, скажем, нефти растет очень быстро, и сейчас огромное количество потребляется, в том числе и как же электроэнергии. И мне кажется, стоит об этом говорить. Дело, что раньше вы говорили о нефти, а сейчас говорим о каких-то виртуальных услугах. Дело в том, что потребление нефти
Only has bicycles and walking. It goes to cars. It's this huge change as well.
Can I ask one question?
Очень быстро росло количество конных перевозок в Европе, когда города развивались.
Okay. The horse transports were also growing in Europe, and the city were growing. It was a question about how the traffic can be organized in Paris, and by the end of the 19th century, so the world is growing too fast. I would like to give the post to Yanis.
Okay, in case, for example, we don't have this type of neutrality and we start price discriminating between users and we change, okay? What will be the effects on the industry? I mean, I guess profitability will increase considerably for DSL operators or whatever. Are we going to see some vertical integration coming in? Because obviously if companies charge really quite a lot of money because they're heavy users, with a no charge now, but what I will do is basically try to buy one of the DSL operators. And at the end of the story, we'll actually, they're kind of trying to see the second best type of theory. Wouldn't it make worse to leave them like price discriminate, because at the end of the story we'll finish up with vertical integrated monopolies instead of having, let's say, an unbundled somehow structure with, okay, a monopoly in one way, but it's better to regulate that. We know more than to have these old.
Yeah, my belief is that if you had no net neutrality rules, you would seem definitely more vertical integration. And we're already starting to see some move towards vertical integration already. In the United States, you have NBC, Comcast, the combination. And yeah, I think you'd see more. And I am an ideological opponent of vertical integration in content industries because I think it leads to problems of free speech at some level, and I think it is very harmful for innovation in the long term and actually for freedom of speech, because there's a natural conflict of interest. The idea is if you own one news station and you own the way of moving it, why do you carry anybody else?
But in this case then, probably net neutrality is the best solution, in the sense that it avoids at least have the vertical integration.
That's what I think.
If you think about first and second best, basically you may have a more realistic picture about it.
Я чуточку все-таки более юридически хотел бы сейчас аспект осветить.
I would like to highlight some legal aspects here. It's wrong that you think I'm asking personal questions. Unfortunately, I didn't listen to Rustam's question. I would like to move the dialogue to the legal environment, because we have discussed these issues in Europe, in the European Council. We also discussed the cross-border internet use, and we also discussed this net neutrality principle, taking into account all these arguments you mentioned here. And I'm also able to agree that there is nothing new here, and a lot of things we're discussing here now. And if we look at them in the very detail, with them the superficial analogy, there are sometimes public and private servitudes and titles that are not really accepted in the right way in our legislation. And all these proposals were made and shaped, and when the minister councils were approving it last year, and probably the definitions in the way the Mihail weren't like, and I can understand Ruslan, and the wording was as follows: in order to regulate the cross-border internet, it is needed to accept and acknowledge the principle of net neutrality. However, the exceptions of this principle should be discussed only in the case when human rights are breached. When talking about the violation of human rights, in this case we can talk about this net neutrality. And if there is no violation of human rights, this is not a subject of regulation on the public level. may ask a question in this connection. The information access is also human right, access to education, to access to communication, because it is not free of charge. We have to pay for traffic. How wide the human rights are. Normally, we look at different categories from a genesis. There is a commercial interest of some operators, and they are not polar. They just exist in a different world to the interest from the information access. And if there is a state, that wants to decrease the price for the information access, because I'm talking about the infrastructure of Skype and cell operators. They are absolutely different. It's not possible to connect all these things, because a very correct political decision is really needed here. In our country, it is not on the agenda. We are not discussing it. So the privatization of traffic within a network concerns my personal interest when I consume this or those services, and the operator says that something can be not in a good speed because the provider of the service didn't sign a contract with us, and you can also choose the operator. Those services are suiting you, and if there is a trust agreement, you can also go to the colleague and they will punish the trust. For example, we have 3 operators in cell operators in Russia, and they're really in love with each other. Could it be also a ground for us to have a doubt that there is no trust? I've got a very strong feeling that the regulation of communication is not efficient in our country, and problem is not in the cell operators, but in the relationships between what we think are the traditional operators and those that also were founded within the last 20 years. And I used to work for the Ministry of Communication of Russia and still stick to this position, and a correct solution of this problem on a deeper level will also take away the critical part of this problem. Alex, I would like to make a short remark. When talking about the violation of my right, when a certain speed is limited, it can be limited for you if you want to use the speed to download a certain video, but for your neighbor, when you download something, doesn't get the needed speed. So I think should be balanced. We shouldn't consider only one user. We also should take into account 99 other users. So it's a kind of balance. I absolutely agree with you. There is only one question. If you block Skype as an event, if you really want to do it in the future, if you want to block Skype and some other applications as events, in this case, you don't harmonize the relationships between the users and the neighbors. You just deprive us of a certain service we used to have. So there is no economic reason to block anything. There is another sense how it's a traffic regulation, traffic control. What is happening in Europe, and Tim probably may know it much better what is happening in United States, because the net neutrality was introduced in 2005 in the United States, but now the Americans are going away from the absolute net neutrality, and they also think about the regulating the traffic, and so it is a kind of evolution, and it's good that we can see it, and we have to take into account what the other countries manage to achieve and how we can control the traffic, where we can also slow down, where we can accelerate. There's also a question of antitrust legislation, and these operators, cell operators, are also well connected with the prices, because we cannot decrease the price because we have an infrastructure. For example, if your traffic is slower, the prices can go up, but the other periods weren't allowed the price because the people will use some other periods because their services are cheaper. So we're don't have any space to play with the prices. So you're talking about a good competition or the bad competition. Now we're discussing a question about the licensing the communication networks in Russia, and the operators' networks are the single communication network of Russia. This is a fundamental for all the services.
And this burden has to be carried by someone, has to be borne by someone. There's a lot of other operators who use this network, but do not invest into this network and thus have an opportunity to work with low prices. So this is a question to the antitrust law. How fair is the competition? Some operators must be licensed, must abide by the conditions of licensing and so on and so forth, and other operators are not liable, and they are using the fruit of others, and that's why they offer lower prices, so there's no competition. Well, this is the right approach. I'm talking about the equal conditions, and in that sense, the decrease of regulating the conventional operators with all those licenses and things like that, this is something that we should look into. But when we cannot resolve this problem because of certain limitations and because of not very strict competition between two operators, we try to solve some other problems, and that leads to more complications. And in that case, yes, and I heartily agree with that. Yes, I think we must have fair conditions. Maybe my words were misinterpreted. I don't want to deprive anyone of anything, and I would like to welcome the appearance of the fourth, fifth, sixth operator. They will probably go bankrupt. They will be replaced with other operators, and this is a normal situation. There are 3 new operators. 3 at once. Microphone, please. That's a benefit, colleagues. That's not an evil. This is a normal process. Of course, if we take India, this is a big question whether that's a benefit or not. Well, it is a benefit in the short-term prospects, but when there's 14 operators and the lowest ARPU, the lowest revenue from the subscribers in the world, and none of those operators can actually pay back for their networks, and probably the market will be more concentrated and the number of operators will reduce. Well, when we don't know the right answer, let the market be the judge and not central planning or the lobbying effort by the leading operator. This will happen by itself, and we will learn how it will happen. Maybe there will be 20 other operators in India because they will learn to do something at a cheaper price. Maybe 10 of 14 will remain. Something will happen. We don't know what. But let it happen without our influence, without our... Well, we should not harm. Yes, it will, Mikhail. If the cost... If the price of energy goes down, the networks are using the power, and the price of power is always growing. And we will learn to maintain our networks at a cheaper price when the power price goes down. Well, we will all learn from that. And we presume that we are a business, we are based on a current situation, we're not academics, we are thinking in the terms of today, and we are based on the current situation. And the current situation, in this current situation, this boat will sink if we allow the market to decide. Maybe tomorrow we will find that we will be wrong, but we don't know that today, and we cannot be guided by abstractions. Well, we would like to listen to the experience of Israel, but I want to make one remark. Well, we all live in a situation of traffic jams in major cities, and we cannot build more roads. And the network infrastructure is just like that. Well, we'll live with bottlenecks. The overall quality will fall until a new technology comes which compresses the traffic better, which is the 4th generation, the 5th generation, 28th generation technology. Unfortunately, engineers always explain me that you cannot exceed the light speed, but fiber optics is too expensive everywhere, to be used everywhere. So, yes, and the operators, the OTT operators will be the first to die because their speed will fall. Do you think I will defend them? Never, never. Either the consumers will support them with money, they will... Facebook will charge us at least a penny a minute, otherwise they will die. Well, I would pay for the road, but no one charges me for the road. Well, there will be traffic jams. Okay. I will say a couple of words. The Israeli experience is not different from any other experience. We've had rather a severe fight between content providers and internet providers, and the 3.5G operators won the battle, and after that we couldn't do anything, but that's a different story. This is a normal market story, and I never doubted what you told us, but I am obliged as a person to express an opinion by a professor of Howard University, Bentler. Professor Bentler said, and that seems like a serious research results, that everything that we say, and without any prejudice, is the result of our old mentality, the mentality of the industrial economy, where the information structure, the ITs, and the providing new information flows follows the way it was at the times of Karl Marx. But it is now replaced by a new economy, the network economy. We don't know what it is. I don't think Professor Bentler knows about that, but he provides certain attributes of that economy, and it will be an altruistic economy where non-competitive ways of transmitting information will prevail. When your neighbor has green grass and your grass is not green, capitalists say, make your grass greener. Some people say, burn their neighbor's grass. And Bentler is talking about the economy of the future. Well, we will have a win-win situation. When you invite your neighbor, talk to your neighbor, tell him how you did things, and he will tell you his experience, and you will both win. And the recent times showed growth of non-profile organization. Yes, I don't know how it will happen, but the very fact that this process is going on and that this is a tendency, I wanted to note that. We're talking, in particular, about the fact that there was a revolution in Israel. It was a shock. There are 3 new mobile operators. The market went down. The Orange, Cellcom and Pelephone lost up to 15% of their stocks. I switched to another channel. I had to change. The prices went down 3-fold. Well, that's capitalism. But I think that will balance, well, the situation will be balanced in a while, but I want to warn. We are about to face great changes. The economy is new. Let us think of the future. Thank you very much. I think that is a very high level of a final comment. You want to interfere.
He just said it sounded to me like from each according to his ability to each according to his needs is what it sounds like. So, it's a quote from Karl Marx, sorry.
Да, спасибо большое всем участникам круглого стола, всем, кто...
Well, I extend my deepest gratitude to all the participants of the round table. I think it was very lucky that we could conduct such a wonderful round table. Thank you.